Rick Sanchez disappeared from his daughter's life for 20 years and came back without a single explanation. The show treated that mystery as a personality for the first 2 seasons. Then theories started building. The Flask, the Morty, the Citadel, the Curve, each one pointing toward the same source. In this video, we break down every theory about Rick Sanchez. Section 1. The Fabricated Origin Theory. For the first 2 seasons of Rick and Morty, Rick Sanchez was a mystery operating inside a comedy. The show kept his past deliberately vague, offering just enough texture to sustain curiosity without ever providing a clear picture. A man who had been absent from his daughter's life for 20 years showed up at her door one day and moved into the garage as if the absence required no explanation. A drinking habit so severe it had become part of his visual identity. The flask always present, the slurred speech always there, sat at the center of his personality without any backstory attached to it. The wild, interdimensional adventures ran on the surface of something darker and more specific. Bird Person, introduced in the Season 1 finale as Rick's oldest and closest friend, told Morty directly that Rick's substance use was tied to an immense pain, and that in Rick's culture, saying a person was in great pain was how those people communicated distress to the ones they cared about. The series played that moment as almost incidental, a line buried inside a party scene that was largely comedic. But it established something the show kept returning to in small, quiet ways across both seasons. Rick Sanchez was carrying a grief so old and so heavy it had restructured his entire personality around the effort of not acknowledging it. Fans reading the show during those first 2 years arrived at a consistent interpretation. A dead wife was the most likely explanation for the shape of everything. The 20-year absence from Beth's life was grief being lived out at a distance rather than indifference. The drinking was a long-term response to something that had happened before the show's timeline began. None of it was confirmed, but the signals were specific and consistent enough that the theory had moved beyond speculation into something closer to shared assumption. The Season 2 episode, Autoerotic Assimilation, ended with Rick sitting alone in his garage, pressing a weapon against his own head, and only surviving because he passed out before he could fire it. That scene was not received by the fan community as a random expression of despair. A man performing nihilism as a personality quirk does not end an episode alone in his garage with a weapon pointed at himself. That was a scene about grief that had exhausted every other outlet. Whatever Rick had lost, it was still with him, actively, in a way that could occasionally threaten to be fatal. Season 3 arrived carrying an enormous weight of expectation around Rick's backstory, and its premiere appeared to deliver the confirmation everyone had been anticipating. The episode opens with Rick inside a Galactic Federation prison, where a Federation agent places him inside a device called a brainalyzer. The machine works by navigating a subject's memories and extracting specific information from within them. The agent wants the formula behind Rick's portal gun, and searching for the moment of its invention leads the agent into a memory that matched the prevailing fan theory almost exactly. A younger Rick is in his garage, working on an early teleportation device, when a portal opens and another version of himself steps through. The stranger offers something remarkable: the secret of interdimensional travel, access to a full multiverse, the opportunity to explore everything that exists across infinite parallel dimensions. Young Rick turns him down. He has a wife named Diane. He has a daughter named Beth. He is content, and whatever the stranger is describing sounds cold and lonely and not like something a person with a family would want. The stranger leaves. Then a bomb falls through a portal into the garage. Diane and Beth are both killed. Rick, sitting in his car at the time, survives. He watches them die from just a few feet away. The memory ends. At that moment, the show appeared to have resolved its central mystery. The origin was real. The grief was real. Decades of emotional insulation had a specific source. And then Rick spoke. Addressing the Federation agent, he stated plainly that the entire memory had been invented. Made up from nothing, assembled as a performance, designed to manipulate the brainalyzer, while his actual escape plan ran in the background. There was no dead wife. The murdered daughter had never existed. The emotional weight of the scene was a feature of a trap, not a leak from his inner life. He said it with casual dismissiveness, gave a brief and dry summary of the supposedly tragic origin he had just been caught performing, described his own supposed grief with something close to mockery, and then proceeded to execute an escape that collapsed the Galactic Federation before the episode was over. The audience had just been told by Rick himself that the dead wife and the murdered daughter were a fiction. What followed in the fan community was a debate that lasted for years and went to the core of what kind of show Rick and Morty was actually trying to be. One side accepted the fabrication claim. The technical argument was strong. Rick had demonstrated throughout the first 2 seasons the ability to construct false environments inside consciousness-reading devices, to understand mental scanning technology from the inside, and to exploit that understanding under pressure. The emotional specificity of the memory, the names Diane and Beth, the precise detail of Rick sitting in a car and watching the bomb drop through a garage window could all have been features of a well-constructed cognitive trap. Moving false memories are harder to scrutinize than emotionally neutral ones. A flat, generic backstory would raise more suspicion than a devastatingly specific one. By making the fabricated memory as convincing and as human as possible, Rick had ensured the agent would believe it and stop looking for anything else. For this group, the claim was Rick explaining what he had done. The emotional resonance of the scene was a tool, deliberately designed and deployed. The opposing side argued from character, and the argument was just as grounded. Rick's emotional presentation across 2 seasons had been built around suppression. He deflected vulnerability with humor. He dismissed affection the moment it surfaced. He performed not caring with a consistency that had begun to look almost effortful. A person who works that hard at appearing indifferent is working against something specific. The Season 2 suicide attempt was not the behavior of a man with nothing underneath him. Pressing a weapon against one's own head in private with no audience and no strategic benefit serves no tactical function. That moment was genuine. And if the Season 2 despair was genuine, then the Season 3 backstory had a genuine source. A man who invented a tragic backstory from nothing and performed it convincingly does not then go home alone and sit in the dark with a weapon. The fabrication claim, this group argued, was the most characteristically Rick response available to him in that prison cell. He had just been caught. Someone had just seen the thing he spent his entire life hiding, so he told them it was a trick. Both sides held their positions through Seasons 3 and 4, and the show gave neither side the clean confirmation they needed. But the evidence that accumulated in the background pointed in one direction. The most overlooked piece of that evidence predated the fabrication claim by 2 full seasons. During a Season 1 episode, Morty ended up on Bird Person's home planet and spent time inside Bird Person's house. The walls of the home were decorated with photographs spanning decades of shared history between Bird Person and Rick. One of those photographs showed a younger Rick holding what appeared to be a baby. The baby had no feathers, was clearly not Bird Person's, and had no other visible context within the picture. It was placed in the show before the fabrication claim existed as a concept, before the writers had any reason to plant a misleading detail. The most natural reading was that the photograph depicted Rick's child. If his family history was entirely invented, the photograph would have no origin. Bird Person had no reason to display a picture of a fictional infant on his wall for decades. The detail was small, easy to miss in a busy scene, but it established that Rick's family history had a physical record stretching back to a time before any official explanation existed. Season 3 itself contained a more directly telling piece of evidence. The episode known informally as the Ricklantis Mix-Up was set entirely within the Citadel of Ricks and followed several different storylines across that society. One of those storylines followed a gentle Rick variant, a woodworker rather than a scientist, who had been captured and imprisoned by the Citadel's administrators. His captors had wired his brain to cycle repeatedly through his happiest memory, making a small wooden jewelry box with a cartoon horse carved on the lid as a birthday gift for his daughter Beth. The chemical his brain released during that memory was then harvested and used to flavor a snack product sold to other Ricks. The product was called Simple Rick's Wafers. The segment was played partly for dark comedy, but its emotional logic made a specific claim. If the feelings Ricks held toward their Beths were not real, they could not be extracted and commodified. The Citadel's administrators understood and had built a business around something Rick publicly denied. The attachment alternate Ricks formed to their daughters was genuine enough and chemically specific enough to generate a product with a market. Season 4 then offered a different kind of signal in the episode centered on a stranger named Tony, who had discovered Rick's private toilet and used it once without permission. Rick's initial response, constructing an elaborate holographic trap designed to humiliate Tony if he ever returned, tracked as territorial pettiness. But Tony died before triggering the trap. Rick attended the funeral in disguise. Later, returning alone to the toilet, Rick sat inside his own humiliation chamber and was mocked by recordings of himself. The episode described him in that moment as the saddest piece of garbage in the cosmos. What the scene revealed, quietly, was that Rick had respected Tony. He had attended the funeral of someone who had done nothing to earn that gesture except exist in Rick's orbit and then leave it. A man who genuinely felt nothing for no one would not be found sitting in his own shame trap, grieving a stranger. Season 4 kept surfacing moments like that. The performed indifference kept developing hairline fractures. By Season 5, the clues had shifted from suggestive to close to definitive. A memory fragment from a younger version of Rick, surfacing in a scene primarily about something else, included a description of himself as one of those Ricks who ends up living with a version of a dead daughter. The phrasing was precise. Not an absent daughter, not an estranged one, a dead one. A man whose tragic backstory was entirely fabricated would have no rational reason to frame his current living situation in those terms. The line arrived without drama, almost parenthetically, which made it more revealing rather than less. The Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, ended the debate. Evil Morty performed a brain scan on Rick as part of his plan to break the central finite curve. The scan surfaced the garage memory. The context was entirely unlike Season 3. No interrogation was running, no escape plan was active, and Evil Morty was extracting information Rick had no reason to manufacture in that moment. The memory played out identically to the Season 3 premiere. The bomb dropped. Diane and Beth died. Confirmed in circumstances where fabrication served no purpose, the origin became simply a true thing that had happened. Season 6 then built the complete account around it. The other Rick from the garage memory was identified as Rick Prime, the first being in any dimension to independently invent interdimensional portal travel. Rick Prime had traveled the multiverse, distributing his technology to alternate versions of himself. When he arrived at dimension C-137 and was refused, he interpreted the refusal as an insult and sent the bomb as retaliation. Rick C-137 survived, spent years eventually inventing his own portal gun, hunted Rick Prime across the multiverse for decades while killing hundreds of alternate Ricks in the process, fought in a galactic revolution alongside Bird Person, helped found and then abandoned the Citadel of Ricks, and eventually came to live in Rick Prime's original dimension, with a version of the family he had lost. Reading the Season 3 denial backward through all of that turns it into something remarkable. Rick was in a Federation prison, and someone had just extracted the rawest and most carefully protected truth of his life and displayed it in front of an enemy. His response was the most tactically sound one available: claim it was fiction. If the memory was invented, everything inside it was worthless intelligence. The murdered wife became a prop. The dead daughter became theater. The 40 years of grief and obsession and multiversal violence that had defined his entire adult life became a performance the agent had been gullible enough to believe. A single sentence converted a real wound into useless disinformation. What the theory and its eventual confirmation reveal is the depth of the defensive architecture Rick had constructed over his lifetime. The nihilism, the drinking, the performed indifference, the reflexive dismissal of every genuine emotional moment. All of it functions as insulation around a wound that never healed. Rick could not afford to let the wound be visible. The one time it was, people had died because of it. A man who carries that logic long enough stops distinguishing between protecting his own emotional privacy and protecting the people currently around him. The armor became both things simultaneously. The detachment he performed was the thing he believed kept the people he was currently trying not to care about safe from anyone who might weaponize his caring against them. The confirmation of the origin did not come through admission. It came from a brain scam performed without his consent, in conditions he did not control, extracted by someone who intended to use the information to destroy him. Even the truth about Rick Sanchez had to be taken from him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fabricated origin turned out to be the realest thing in the show. Rick used his own worst memory as a decoy, then spent 2 more seasons insisting the decoy was invented. Next, the theory that his legendary intelligence might not be entirely natural, and what a teenager writhing on a school hallway floor has to do with it. Section 2. The Megaseeds and the Flask Theory. Radioactive green seeds hidden in the body cavities of a teenager are an unusual choice for a series premiere. Most shows open with something designed to establish tone, introduce character, and ease a new audience into the world being built. The pilot episode of Rick and Morty does all of that, but it builds its central mission around a task that is equal parts absurd and specific. Rick needs Morty to carry seeds from a dimension called 35C back through interdimensional customs by concealing them in a place no scanner would find. The seeds are called megaseeds. They grow from a species of tree with a biological property unlike anything else established in the episode. Contact with the seeds makes a person smarter. Significantly, measurably, demonstrably smarter. Morty discovers this firsthand when Rick retrieves the seeds from where he had hidden them, and the intelligence flooding through Morty's body is immediate and overwhelming. Within seconds, he is speaking with a clarity and sophistication that bears no resemblance to the nervous, stumbling 14-year-old from the first act. He can solve problems, analyze situations, and articulate complex ideas with a fluency he has never shown before and will not show again. Then, the seeds wear off. And when they do, Morty collapses onto the floor and begins drooling uncontrollably. The drooling is played as a punchline in the pilot. Morty is on the floor, incoherent, saliva running freely from his open mouth, while Rick explains cheerfully that the after effects will have him in that condition for a few hours and that they will need to go back for more seeds eventually. The scene closes out the episode. The premise has been established, the tone has been set, and the image of Morty drooling on the school hallway floor is the last thing the audience sees before the credits roll. As a comedic ending, it works cleanly. As a piece of series mythology, it planted something that took years to fully surface. Rick drools too. He has always drooled. It is one of the most consistent and recognizable physical details of his character across every season of the show. A small, wet trail at the corner of his mouth appears so regularly that it reads simply as part of how Rick Sanchez is drawn. Most viewers internalized it as a visual shorthand for his recklessness, his impaired state, his general disregard for the presentation of himself that other people maintain. He is a man who burps mid-sentence and calls it speaking. The drooling fit the pattern without demanding its own explanation. The theory that emerged from the fan community around this detail is one of the oldest and most persistent in the entire Rick and Morty discourse. The argument runs as follows. Rick's drooling is not a character quirk or an animation choice. Rick's drooling is the same symptom Morty exhibited in the pilot when his mega seed enhancement wore off. Where Morty experienced a brief spike of intelligence followed by a sudden collapse into incoherence, Rick exists in a version of that state that has been stretched across his entire adult life. His genius is not his own. It is maintained externally, sustained by ongoing megaseed consumption, and the drooling visible throughout the show is the low-level symptom of that sustained altered state, present because the dosing is never quite sufficient to eliminate the tell entirely, or because Rick has calibrated it carefully enough to function, but not so precisely that the physical effects disappear completely. The pilot established the mechanism. The drooling established the connection. What the flask theory added was an answer to the question of delivery. Rick carries a flask constantly. It appears in his hand, at his lips, being replaced in his coat pocket with the casual frequency of a habit so old it requires no conscious attention. The assumption, treated as settled, is that the flask contains alcohol. Rick is established as an alcoholic from the series' opening moments. His drinking is not a subplot or a periodic character beat. It is a running feature of how he moves through the world, how he relates to other people, and how he is perceived by his family. The flask fits naturally inside that story. Nobody questioned what was in it because the context answered the question before it was asked. The theory questions the context. If Rick is a megaseed user, and if the seeds boost his intelligence significantly enough to account for the gap between his stated abilities and whatever baseline genius he actually possesses underneath the enhancement, then he needs a reliable delivery system that travels with him at all times. He needs something he can access continuously, across dimensions, in the middle of adventures where stopping to obtain a specific botanical from a specific dimension would be impossible. He needs a portable dose. The flask, already present, already established as something Rick keeps close and returns to constantly, becomes that delivery system. The theory proposes that whatever Rick is drinking from the flask is not purely, or not exclusively, alcohol. The seeds can apparently be infused into a liquid. Morty's brief superintelligence in the pilot came from seeds he had been carrying inside his body, pressed against tissue, not dissolved in anything. And the effect was still fast and powerful. A concentrated liquid preparation would be both more consistent and more convenient. The drooling, in this reading, is the thread that ties everything together. Morty drooled when the seeds wore off. Rick drools throughout the series as part of his standard presentation. The simplest bridge between those two facts is that Rick is always in some version of the state Morty occupied at the end of the pilot. A person running on an intelligence that is being chemically maintained rather than naturally sustained. Justin Roiland, who co-created the series and voiced Rick from the pilot through season 6, was asked directly about the flask's contents during a Reddit question and answer session. The question came from a fan who had clearly been thinking about exactly this theory. Roiland's response deflected without denying. He confirmed that in the pilot's opening scene, Rick had been drinking Hennessy, and then stated that the show was not ready to discuss the flask's contents beyond that. The deflection is notable for what it does not say. He did not describe the flask as containing alcohol. He did not say the theory was wrong. He referenced only the pilot's cold open, a specific scene in which the flask appears before any of the Megaseed storyline begins, and then redirected the conversation away from the question entirely. For a detail that should have been simple to dismiss, the non-answer was conspicuous. The pilot itself, looked at carefully, offers more texture than a first viewing suggests. Rick insists on Morty making the seed run specifically, not Summer, not Beth, not any of the countless alien entities Rick encounters regularly and who could presumably handle the task without Rick risking his family relationships. When Morty questions why he has to be the one, Rick's explanation covers practical necessity without fully accounting for his insistence. Morty is Rick's companion. The show will establish later, and at some length, that Morty's neural patterns serve a specific cloaking function for Rick. But in the pilot, that explanation does not yet exist. Rick's urgency about retrieving the seeds, and specifically his urgency about Morty being involved, reads differently once the flask theory is active. A man who depends on seeds for his cognitive function treats the acquisition of those seeds as a priority, and he treats the people involved in acquiring them as essential participants rather than optional helpers. By season 3, the seeds had appeared again in a way that many viewers noted but few discussed. One episode featured a brief scene on a farm operated by a Rick variant whose entire life had organized itself around megatree cultivation. The farm Rick was unremarkable in every other dimension except this one. He had dedicated himself completely to growing the trees whose seeds produce radical intelligence enhancement. In the vast multiverse of Rick and Morty, which contains alternate versions of Rick doing essentially everything, one of those versions had found the trees, recognized their value, and made them the center of his existence. The scene moved quickly, and the farm Rick appeared only briefly, but the details sat inside the larger world as a quiet confirmation that the seeds were not a one-episode plot device. They had a place in the broader ecology of what various Ricks found worth pursuing. The most substantial evidence against the theory is also the most straightforward. Rick's intelligence is not just high, it is categorically different from anything else in the multiverse in a way that megaseeds alone cannot explain. The central finite curve, which will come up in full in a later section, is a structure Rick built that defines a finite portion of the multiverse as the subset where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in any given universe. The other Ricks who banded together to oppose Rick C137, who ultimately had to surrender and build the Citadel as a peace offering, acknowledged him as their leader because he was stronger than all of them combined. Rick Prime, the first being in any dimension to independently invent interdimensional portal travel, identified Rick C137 as a distinct and separate genius because C137 was the only Rick who independently invented the same technology. Two beings across all of infinity arrived at the same breakthrough independently: Rick Prime and the grieving father who built a portal gun in his garage to find the man who had destroyed his family. That kind of intelligence, the kind that produces the same result as the singular creative genius of the first being to ever crack interdimensional travel, does not read as a chemically sustained performance. The counter-argument from the theory's supporters is that the enhancement does not need to account for everything. A person with a naturally high baseline intelligence, who is also enhancing that baseline chemically, could produce results that exceed what either the natural intelligence or the chemical enhancement would produce independently. Rick is unquestionably brilliant. The theory does not propose that he is stupid underneath the seeds. It proposes that his genius has a ceiling even he does not know about, that the level the rest of the multiverse has come to regard as Rick's normal operating level is not his unaugmented state, and that whatever the true gap between his natural and enhanced intelligence looks like, Rick himself may not be entirely certain. That last possibility is the one that gives the theory its most interesting dimension as a character analysis. Rick's relationship with his own intelligence is not simple. He describes it regularly as a burden rather than a gift. The certainty he has about everything, the inability to be surprised by most of what the universe presents, the way meaning drains out of experience when one can always see how things work and why they work and what they will eventually become. All of that is something Rick treats as an inescapable feature of who he is. A man who has sustained his own genius chemically for decades without knowing it, or while knowing it and choosing not to examine the implications, would have built an identity around an altered version of himself. The person Rick believes himself to be might be the product of a habit he formed long ago, out of grief and necessity, and never stopped. It is also worth noting that Rick's intelligence is consistently broadest, most comprehensive, and most reliable in situations of extreme stress. Under interrogation, while escaping from prison, in the middle of a crisis with no preparation time, his cognitive output is at its most extraordinary. These are also the moments when Rick's access to his flask is most restricted or most irrelevant, which functions as either evidence against the theory or, depending on how the argument is constructed, evidence that whatever enhancement he uses has a long half-life that persists well past the moment of consumption. The flask and the seeds remain unconfirmed. The show has never provided a scene in which someone opens the flask, identifies the contents, and allows the question to be answered cleanly. The deliberate non-answer from the show's co-creator, delivered in response to a direct question about exactly this, kept the theory alive in a way that a flat denial would have ended immediately. A simple response about what is in the flask would have taken 4 words. What the audience received instead was a redirect to a single scene from the pilot and a statement that the show was not ready to discuss it. A show that is not ready to discuss what is in the flask is not a show that dismissed the question as meaningless. It is a show that is keeping the answer somewhere specific for a specific time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The flask theory leaves open a version of Rick whose defining trait is maintained rather than innate. Next, the theory about why Rick keeps Morty close at all, and why the answer the show gave in Season 1 turned out to be only partially true. Section 3. The Morty Brainwave Theory. Season 1, Episode 10 of Rick and Morty is the first episode to step back from the Adventure of the Week format and look directly at the structure underneath the show. Its title is Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, and its central conflict involves Rick being accused by the Council of Ricks of murdering alternate versions of himself across the multiverse. As Rick and Morty go on the run and the investigation deepens, the episode delivers what felt at the time like a foundational piece of Rick and Morty mythology, an explanation for why Rick keeps Morty specifically and why every other Rick across the multiverse keeps a Morty too. The mechanics, as the Council explains them, are straightforward. Rick's brain generates a specific type of neural signal. The signal is a product of his extraordinary intelligence, a cognitive frequency so distinct and so powerful that it can be detected and tracked by the kinds of enemies a person accumulates when they have spent decades violating the laws of multiple civilizations across countless dimensions. A brain that operates the way Rick's does lights up like a signal fire to anyone with the technology to look for it. Running a portal gun solo, Rick would be visible to every hostile force in the multiverse at all times. He would never have privacy, never have the element of surprise, and never be safe from the queue of entities with reasons to find him. Morty's brain cancels the signal. The neural output of a deeply average 14-year-old. A boy who struggles through school, who panics under pressure, whose emotional life runs in large and undisciplined circles that have nothing to do with the cold, systematic reasoning Rick's intelligence produces, generates its own frequency. That frequency is the precise opposite of Rick's. When the two travel together, the signals interact and cancel each other out. Rick becomes, neurologically speaking, invisible. The genius dissolves into background noise. To any scanner looking for the specific signature of a Rick-level intellect, there is nothing to find. This is why every Rick has a Morty. The episode presented it as policy, as something the broader Rick community had independently discovered and collectively adopted as the rational response to the tracking problem. Ricks across the multiverse had arrived at the same solution. Keep a Morty close, use the brainwave cancellation to move freely, and accept the minor inconvenience of traveling with a nervous teenager as the cost of operating without a target on one's back. The fan community absorbed this explanation and found it entirely satisfying for several reasons. It was logical within the show's internal rules. It gave the Rick-Morty relationship an instrumental dimension that complemented the affectionate one, making Rick's reasons for bringing Morty along more complicated than simple fondness. It implied that every other Rick in the multiverse had made the same calculation, which framed the partnership as something universal and systematic rather than personal. And it provided a built-in explanation for the Morty Matrix facility the episode later revealed, a structure where hundreds of Mortys were kept in conditions of pain and distress, their brainwaves harvested in bulk to provide cover for a Rick operating without a living companion. The facility was one of the episode's most disturbing images, made more disturbing by the logic behind it. If Morty brainwaves are what make Rick invisible, then a sufficient quantity of Morty brainwaves concentrated in one place makes a Rick effectively undetectable. The suffering of the Mortys in the Matrix was not random cruelty. It was an industrial application of the brainwave principle. Evil Morty's first appearance in the same episode added another layer. The villain of the episode was initially presented as an evil Rick controlling a Morty puppet with a device embedded in the puppet's head. Morty, it turned out, was actually the one in control, operating a robotic Rick as cover. The detail that made evil Morty's scheme possible was the brainwave principle itself. Because Morty waves mask Rick signals, a Morty who wanted to move through Rick space undetected could do so simply by being a Morty. The brainwaves that every Rick used to stay hidden were the same brainwaves that allowed evil Morty to hide his intelligence and his intentions inside a demographic that the entire Citadel treated as negligible. He was invisible not despite being a Morty, but because of it. The brainwave theory had produced its own ironic exploit. For years, close Rick counters of the Rick kind stood as the definitive explanation for the Rick-Morty dynamic. It was specific, mechanical, and internally consistent. The partnership made sense. Rick needed the brainwave cover, Morty provided it, and the affection that had developed between them was real but secondary to the functional reason for their arrangement. The theory that grew around this explanation focused primarily on its implications for Morty's characterization. If Morty's value to Rick was specifically rooted in his cognitive averageness, then every time the show depicted Rick dismissing or diminishing Morty's intelligence, it was Rick maintaining the conditions he depended on. A Morty who stopped being average would stop being useful in the way Rick needed. The cruelty in this reading had a purpose. That theory developed a significant following, and the evidence available in the earlier seasons supported it well enough that it became one of the most discussed structural arguments in Rick and Morty fan spaces. Rick's consistent pattern of undermining Morty's confidence, blocking his intellectual development, and describing him to others in terms that emphasized his limitations rather than his capabilities, mapped neatly onto the logic of a man who needed to keep a specific kind of brain nearby, and had decided that the most efficient way to maintain that brain's specific properties was to ensure the person hosting it never grew out of them. Season 5 then introduced a scene that complicated everything. The episode A Mortican Grick features a moment between Rick and Morty in which Rick, in a context that strips away most of his habitual deflection, offers a description of why he actually keeps Morty around. The reason he gives has nothing to do with brainwaves, nothing to do with neural cancellation, and nothing to do with the tracking problem the Council of Ricks described in Season 1. Rick's stated reason, delivered in a tone of unusual directness, is that he needs Morty so he can yell jokes at someone. He needs a companion for his commentary. The multiverse, experienced alone, is something Rick has already tried. The drinking and the nihilism and the long spiral that preceded his arrival at Beth's house all happened in a period of solitary travel. What Rick actually cannot manage, when stripped down to what he most honestly needs, is the absence of someone to talk to. The fan community's response to this scene divided along predictable lines. One group treated it as a retcon, an instance of the writers walking back an earlier piece of mythology that had become too constraining. The brainwave explanation was tight and mechanical and implied things about Rick's character that later seasons were moving away from, making the real reason for Morty's presence something warmer and more human, aligned with the show's increasing interest in Rick's emotional interior. But it came at the cost of the earlier architecture. The other group argued that both things were simultaneously true, which required reading the Season 5 revelation not as a replacement for the Season 1 explanation, but as an addition to it. Rick genuinely needs the brainwave cover. He also genuinely needs the company. A man who had spent years traveling alone in a state of unraveling grief and found that solitude made the grief worse would have two separate and equally real motivations for keeping the partnership going, one tactical and one emotional, neither one negating the other. A third reading of the scene, less common but more interesting, is that the Season 5 explanation is Rick doing what Rick always does when someone gets close to the real version of something. He replaces the unbearable explanation with a manageable one. Telling Morty that the brainwave logic was always the primary reason for their partnership would require Rick to acknowledge that what looked like a relationship was originally a functional arrangement he walked into for purely strategic reasons, and that the affection came second. Telling Morty instead that he brings him along because he needs someone to yell jokes at is a way of saying something true, because it is true, while using that true thing to displace a different true thing that is harder to say out loud. Rick is capable of keeping multiple real and competing motives in the same action without acknowledging any of them clearly. That is, in fact, one of his most consistent character traits. The brainwave theory's most durable contribution to the analysis of Rick's character is the question it raises about what Rick's dismissal of Morty has actually been doing. The show has staged that dismissal consistently across every season. Rick calls Morty stupid in front of other people, in private, in situations where the insult serves no strategic purpose and where Morty is clearly hurt by it. The brainwave explanation gave those moments a function. Rick was maintaining the cognitive conditions he depended on by preventing Morty from developing confidence in his own intelligence. But as the show has accumulated more seasons and more evidence of Rick's emotional interior, a second explanation for the same behavior has grown alongside the first. A person who loves someone and cannot say so, who needs that person's presence and cannot admit the need, who has structured his entire adult life around not forming attachments he cannot afford to lose again, might express the thing he cannot say by making that person feel small. Not because the person is small, and not primarily to maintain their brainwave profile, but because diminishing someone is a way of performing distance from them while maintaining proximity to them. Rick cannot say he needs Morty. He may not be able to say he loves him. What he can do, and what he does with remarkable consistency, is make Morty feel like the lesser partner in an arrangement where the opposite is quietly true. That inversion is what the theory, at its deepest, points toward. The show established a world in which every Rick needs a Morty. The cover story was brainwaves, and the cover story was real. But the thing underneath the cover story, the thing that made Morty specifically the one Rick came back to across every crisis, every alternate dimension, every opportunity to replace him with a different Morty or no Morty at all, was something the brainwave logic could not account for. Rick C137 has done things for Morty that no purely instrumental relationship explains. He has taken risks for Morty that violated his own survival instincts. He has chosen Morty's well-being over tactical advantage, in situations where a purely rational calculation would have produced a different result. The Season 5 episode that offered the yelling jokes explanation is also the same episode in which Rick acquires two crows as substitute companions and briefly attempts to run his operation without Morty at all. The crow experiment fails. The crows turn out to be more independent than Rick anticipated, and their arc runs its own course while Rick is left without what he was trying to replace. He returns to Morty. The episode stages the return without sentimentality and without a clear statement of what the return means, which is very much how Rick and Morty operates when it is being most honest about its characters. The situation simply resolves back into the default arrangement, and the reason for the resolution is left to inference rather than declaration. Inference, in this case, is not difficult. The brainwave cancellation is real. The tactical value of a Morty is documented, and Rick, across multiple seasons, has consistently demonstrated that the tactical value alone would never be sufficient to make him this specific about this particular version of this particular companion. The theory that the brainwave logic was always a rationalization, a back formation constructed to explain a partnership Rick had already committed to for reasons he could not comfortably articulate, is supported by the pattern of his behavior more than by any single scene or line. He did not acquire Morty because he needed the cover. He needed the cover, and Morty happened to provide it. The difference between those two sentences is the difference between a functional arrangement and a relationship that became real before either participant had a name for what it was. The Morty brainwave theory, in the end, is less about neurons and cancellation frequencies and more about the narrative function of a rational explanation. Rick lives inside rational explanations. He reaches for them the way other people reach for comfort. When something in his life resists the rational framing, he builds a more elaborate version of the frame rather than abandoning the approach. The Season 1 episode gave him a rational explanation for the most emotionally significant relationship in his current life. And the fan community accepted it because it was internally consistent and mechanically convincing. What the show has done across the seasons since is pile up evidence that the rational explanation, while technically accurate, was always sitting on top of something Rick has never been able to fully look at directly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The brainwave theory turns out to be both true and incomplete, which is a fair description of most of what Rick offers as explanation for his own behavior. Next, the theory about the wall Rick built around infinity itself, and the real reason it may have been constructed in the first place. Section 4. The Central Finite Curve Theory. The first mention of the central finite curve arrives without announcement. Season 1, Episode 10, the same episode that introduced the brainwave mechanics and the Council of Ricks, contains a single line delivered by one of the council members to Rick during his trial. The line is not highlighted or repeated. It does not receive a definition or a follow-up. A council member calls Rick the malcontent among all the Ricks in the central finite curve, and the conversation moves on. At the time, the phrase read as flavor, one of the many pieces of world-building jargon the show scattered across its early episodes to build the impression of a fully realized universe operating just out of frame. Most viewers processed it and moved past it without storing it separately. The writers had planted something they would not pick up again for 4 full seasons, in the same episode where they planted Evil Morty and the Morty Matrix, as if that hour of television was a warehouse for every major idea the show would eventually need. The central finite curve is a wall, not a metaphorical wall, not a bureaucratic classification system, but a physical structure built into the architecture of the multiverse itself. Before it was constructed, the multiverse available to portal travel was genuinely infinite. Every possible dimension, every possible configuration of reality, every possible version of every possible world, all of it accessible to anyone with the right technology. The curve changed that. Once it existed, the multiverse accessible through portal guns was not infinite anymore. It was a walled section of infinity containing only those universes that met a specific criterion. The criterion was Rick. Every universe inside the curve is a universe where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in existence. Every universe where something or someone smarter than Rick might be found sits outside the wall, unreachable through standard portal technology, effectively removed from the version of reality that Ricks and their Mortys could explore. Evil Morty described it in the Season 5 finale with the most precise language the show had offered to that point. He explained that the Ricks had taken all of infinite reality and separated it into 2 portions, everything where Rick was the smartest entity and everything else. They walled off the first portion and called it the multiverse. Every adventure, every crisis, every dimension Rick and Morty had ever traveled to across 5 seasons of the show, every corner of what the characters referred to as the infinite multiverse, existed within a finite and specifically curated section of actual infinity. The genuine multiverse, the one containing dimensions where Rick Sanchez was not the dominant intelligence, was on the other side of a wall Rick had built to ensure he would never have to visit it. Evil Morty's plan was to destroy the wall and leave. He spent years building toward the capacity to break the curve and cross into genuine infinity, the portion of reality where Rick's supremacy was not guaranteed, where the game was not rigged in advance, and where a Morty could theoretically exist without being defined by his relationship to a Rick. The Season 5 finale showed him do it. The curve broke, Evil Morty passed through, and the coordinates of everything the main characters understood as their universe shifted permanently. The surface reading of why the curve was built is ego. The evidence supporting that reading is substantial. Rick is a man whose relationship with his own intelligence is complicated in ways that look, from the outside, like the relationship a deeply insecure person has with the one thing they cannot afford to question. He calls himself the smartest man in the universe, with a frequency that a genuinely secure genius would find unnecessary. He responds to perceived challenges to that status with a disproportionate aggression that suggests the status itself is load-bearing in a way that makes threatening it feel dangerous rather than merely annoying. The central finite curve, read through the lens of ego, is the ultimate expression of that insecurity. A man who needed to be the smartest entity in any room he entered simply made it structurally impossible to enter a room where he was not. Evil Morty endorsed that reading explicitly and made it the moral center of his argument for escaping. He framed the curve as a prison constructed for the benefit of one personality type, a cosmic arrangement designed to serve Rick's need for supremacy at the expense of every Morty who had ever been bred, partnered, and kept inside the resulting system. The Mortys were the maintenance crew for Rick's ego. Their brainwaves masked Rick's signal. Their presence made Rick's adventures possible. Their suffering in facilities like the Morty Matrix was the infrastructure on which the entire curve-bound multiverse operated. Evil Morty had been inside that system long enough to understand it completely, and his conclusion was that the curve had been built to serve one purpose: to ensure that Rick Sanchez never had to encounter anything that made him feel small. That reading is coherent and internally supported. It is also, a significant fan theory argues, incomplete. The alternative theory about the curve's creation begins with the same facts Evil Morty presented, but interprets them through Rick C137's specific history rather than through the general behavior of the Rick archetype. Rick C137 is not simply a Rick who values his own intelligence above all else. He is a Rick whose intelligence became the entire substitute for everything that was taken from him. Before Diane and Beth were killed, Rick was a family man who had turned down the offer of interdimensional travel specifically because he valued his home life more than the infinite possibilities his alternate self was describing. The intelligence was always there, but it was not the organizing principle of his identity. His family was. When the bomb came through the garage portal and his family was destroyed, the intelligence became the only territory that remained his. He built a portal gun and hunted Rick Prime across the multiverse, and it was his genius that made that possible. The galaxy-wide revolution against the Galactic Federation that he helped lead alongside Birdperson and Squanchy was possible because of his genius. The war he waged against the Ricks who banded together to stop him was won because of his genius. Every significant thing he did in the decades between losing his family and arriving at Beth's door was done because of an intelligence that had no competing priority anymore. His genius was not his identity before the garage. After the garage, it became all of him. A Rick who understood that process from the inside, who had watched his own personality collapse and reorganize around the only faculty that had not been destroyed along with everything else, would understand something about what intelligence costs a person when it becomes their entire self. He would know, in a way that a Rick who had never lost a family could not know, what the full weight of genius does to a life when nothing else is there to balance it. The fan theory proposes that Rick built the curve not only, or even primarily, to protect his own ego, but to protect the Ricks who had not become him. Across the genuine infinite multiverse, countless versions of Rick Sanchez existed who had never been visited by Rick Prime, whose Dianes and Beths were alive, whose lives were still organized around a family rather than a vendetta. Those Ricks had not developed into the specific kind of person Rick C137 had become. They were still, in some meaningful sense, the version of Rick who had stood in the garage and refused the offer because he had something worth staying home for. By creating the curve and limiting portal access to the subset of dimensions where Rick was already the dominant intelligence, Rick C137 may have been constructing a barrier that kept the beings who existed outside that boundary, including versions of intelligence that might threaten or destroy the ordinary Ricks, from ever reaching the dimensions where his counterparts were living ordinary lives. The curve, in this reading, was not a monument to ego. It was a wall built by a man who knew exactly what happened when something more powerful than a Rick decided to interfere in a Rick's domestic life. Rick Prime had done it to him. He had built a structure that ensured Rick Prime, or anything like Rick Prime, could never reach the version of infinity where the ordinary, family-connected Ricks still existed. The tragedy of the theory is that it would mean the curve was an act of protection, wearing the mask of arrogance, and that evil Morty, who understood the system's mechanics perfectly, misread the motive entirely, because the motive was hidden behind an exterior that looked exactly like ego. Both readings coexist in the show, because the show does not definitively settle the question of why the curve was built. What the show does settle is that Rick was instrumental in its creation. The Season 5 finale's account of Rick's history shows him helping to design and construct the Citadel as part of a peace agreement with the Ricks who had organized against him. The curve appears to have come from the same period, the same set of negotiations and arrangements, though the exact sequence of decisions that led to its construction remains partly obscured. What is confirmed is that Rick C137 was not simply a participant in the curve's construction. His brain was the source of the blueprint Evil Morty needed to break it. When Evil Morty scanned Rick's mind during the Season 5 finale, what he was looking for was the specific technical knowledge required to destroy the curve's architecture. That knowledge lived in Rick's head because Rick had been central to building it. The curve was not something done to Rick or built around him. He made it. The implications for everything inside the show's first 5 seasons are considerable. Every dimension Rick and Morty visited was pre-selected. Every alien civilization they encountered, every cosmic threat they navigated, every seemingly infinite variety of reality they explored existed within a carefully maintained subset of actual possibility. The show's central theme of infinite possibility, the idea that anything could happen and any version of events could be discovered somewhere in the multiverse, was operating within a curated boundary. Rick had seen genuine infinity during his years of hunting Rick Prime before the curve existed, and he had chosen to build a smaller, controlled version of it and call it the multiverse. Whether that choice came from fear, from grief, from ego, or from a desire to protect people he could never tell he was protecting, it produced the same result, a universe that looked boundless, but had a wall. The moment in Season 7 when Rick deliberately destabilized the curve to flush out Rick Prime adds a final layer to the theory. By that point, Rick's entire remaining purpose was finding and killing Rick Prime. He had already killed Rick Prime's family across various dimensions. Rick Prime had used the Omega device to erase Diane from every universe in existence, removing even the possibility of finding a version of her anywhere in the multiverse. When Rick chose to damage the structure he had built, to shake the architecture of the curve hard enough that Rick Prime would be dislodged and findable, he was prioritizing his vengeance over the system he had spent decades constructing. Whatever the curve had been for, whatever it had protected or enclosed or served, Rick was prepared to break it when the alternative was living with Rick Prime still out there somewhere. Evil Morty's argument was that the curve was Rick's ego made structural. The fam theory argues it was Rick's grief made structural. The show's evidence suggests both are partially correct, which is the most honest description available for most of the choices Rick Sanchez has made since a bomb came through a garage portal and left him alone with his intelligence and no one left to use it for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The curve turns out to be a wall with more than one possible motive behind it, which is characteristic of everything Rick builds. Next, the theory that reframes the show's hero as its actual villain, and the surprisingly strong case the evidence makes for it. Section 5. The Rick is the villain theory. 7,150,792. That is the number of crimes and offenses on record against Rick Sanchez C-137, according to the Galactic Federation, cited during the Season 2 finale when Rick surrenders himself to Federation custody. The number is delivered quickly, almost as a throwaway detail inside a scene with several other things happening, and it lands as comedy rather than horror because the show's framing has spent 2 seasons presenting Rick as a rogue genius, operating outside conventional rules, rather than as an entity whose behavior constitutes a genuine catastrophe. 7 Million Crimes reads as an absurdist joke. Written down and examined plainly, it describes a level of harm that puts Rick Sanchez in a category most fictional universes reserve for world-ending antagonists. The theory that Rick is the show's actual villain is not new, and it is not fringe. It has been present in the fan community since the early seasons, has been articulated by multiple critics and analysts, and has drawn support from the show itself at key moments. It does not require ignoring the genuine warmth Rick demonstrates toward his family, or dismissing the grief that underlies his nihilism, or pretending his story is simple. The most interesting version of the theory accounts for all of that and still arrives at a conclusion that the show has been edging toward since its earliest episodes. Rick Sanchez, measured by his actual effect on the universe, is among the most destructive forces within it. And the narrative frame that positions him as a flawed but essentially heroic protagonist is one of the most carefully constructed misdirections in contemporary animated television. The Cronenberg incident is the clearest single piece of evidence. Season 1, Episode 6, Rick Potion Number 9, begins as a story about Morty wanting Rick to create a love potion to attract the girl he has feelings for. What follows is a cascade of errors. The potion spreads uncontrollably through the school, then through the town, then through the entire planet, converting the global population into creatures called Cronenbergs, grotesque biological mutations that retain their mass and mobility but have lost everything recognizable about them as human beings. Earth is destroyed, not metaphorically, not temporarily, not in a way that can be undone. The entire population of the planet is permanently transformed into something inhuman and incomprehensible. Rick's response, once he determines that the situation cannot be fixed, is to locate an alternate dimension where a version of himself and Morty have just died in an unrelated accident. He and Morty replace those dead versions of themselves, bury the bodies, and move into the house of a family that is not theirs. The original dimension, with its Cronenberged population and a Beth and Jerry and Summer who have been abandoned without explanation, remains exactly as Rick left it. Rick did not apologize. He did not attempt any extended effort at repair before deciding the situation was unresolvable. He located an exit and took it, leaving an entire planet of 8 billion transformed human beings behind him. The show treated the incident with a level of tonal gravity that was more than its usual comedic register, and Morty's response in the immediate aftermath, digging graves for their previous selves in a field behind the house, registered as genuinely traumatic. But the structure of the series moved forward as if the Cronenberg dimension was simply no longer relevant. Rick had left, so the show left too. What remained behind in that reality was never addressed again as a moral weight Rick needed to reckon with. That pattern of causing consequences that would be catastrophic within any conventional moral framework, and then either leaving or finding a technical solution that removes the need for genuine accountability, runs through Rick's behavior across every season. The Galactic Federation's 7 million crimes are not a bureaucratic inflation of minor offenses. The show's episodic adventures, watched cumulatively, produce a body count and a scale of collateral damage that rivals organized warfare. Rick has destroyed civilizations while passing through them. He has killed creatures that possessed consciousness and agency in quantities that would constitute mass atrocity if performed by any force the audience was asked to root against. He has used family members as instruments, exposed them to mortal danger without their fully informed consent, and on at least one occasion specifically structured a situation so that Morty's trauma from a previous adventure would prevent him from running to his parents with information that would get Rick removed from the house. Evil Morty made the structural version of this argument in the Season 5 finale, and it is the version that has proved most durable in critical discussions of the show. His case was not simply that Rick had done harmful things. His case was that Rick had built the systems within which everyone else was trapped. The central finite curve was Rick's construction. The citadel of Rick's was Rick's construction. The breeding arrangement that produced Morty's specifically to serve as cognitive camouflage for Rick's was a system Rick had been central in designing and implementing. Evil Morty's position was that Rick did not operate within a universe that happened to be unfair. Rick had engineered specific features of the universe's unfairness and then navigated them more skillfully than anyone else, which he then used as evidence of his own exceptionalism. The smartest man in the universe was the smartest man in a portion of infinity he had carefully constructed to guarantee that outcome. The show's own dialogue acknowledges this reading without fully committing to it. During Season 1, Summer asks Morty whether Rick is a villain, and Morty's response is one of the most quoted lines in the series. Morty tells her that Rick is not a villain, but that he also should not be her hero. The line positions Rick in a middle space that the show returned to repeatedly across its run, the chaotic neutral who cannot be cleanly assigned to either side of a moral ledger, because his actions resist that kind of accounting. But chaotic neutral is not a verdict of innocence. It is a description of a person who operates outside moral systems rather than within them. And operating outside moral systems does not mean the harm caused is any less real for the people on the receiving end of it. Season 3's finale offered the show's most direct self-examination of this dimension. The episode ended with the family gathered together in domestic comfort, laughing at Rick's expense, and Rick sitting outside in his garage, observing the scene through a window. His internal monologue, delivered in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, described a plan to reassert control over the family through a slow and methodical series of manipulations that would make himself indispensable to each of them, and ultimately return him to the position of patriarch he had occupied before the season's events displaced him. The plan was articulated with the calm, systematic efficiency of someone who had made this kind of calculation many times before and found it reliable. What made the scene disturbing was not that Rick had a plan. Rick always has a plan. What made it disturbing was the specific nature of the plan, the deliberate use of the people he loved as instruments in a strategy designed to serve his own emotional needs, framed internally as strategy, rather than as the acknowledgement of those emotional needs that would require a different kind of response. Dan Harmon, the show's co-creator, has described Rick in terms that align more closely with the villain reading than with the heroic one. Harmon has said publicly that a central element of Rick's character is his narcissism, and that the show treats narcissism not as a quirky personality feature, but as a genuine destructive force. Narcissism in Rick's case is not merely self-centeredness. It is the organizing principle of a worldview in which other people exist primarily in relation to his own needs and experiences, in which genuine reciprocal care is structurally very difficult, and in which the capacity for love, which Rick unquestionably possesses, is constantly filtered through a defensive architecture that converts it into something that looks, from the outside, more like ownership than affection. Harmon has connected Rick's self-destruction to this same narcissistic core, describing the revenge quest against Rick Prime as ultimately an elaborate version of self-harm, a way of destroying himself through the destruction of the thing that represented everything he had become. The defense of Rick against the villain reading draws from two primary sources. The first is his track record of saving the world, which is documented and substantive. The American president acknowledges in Season 3 that the government has declined to pursue Rick and Morty's many legal violations, specifically because the two of them have saved Earth on multiple occasions, and that the net calculation favors leaving them alone. Rick has intervened in genuine existential threats to human civilization, has protected people he could easily have ignored, and has, on multiple occasions, accepted significant personal cost to produce outcomes that were broadly beneficial. A villain who saved the world several times over is a difficult villain to characterize cleanly. The second line of defense is the distinction between Rick's behavior and Rick's character. The Cronenberg incident, the 7 million crimes, the Citadel's foundations, all of it can be attributed to a person in profound, unprocessed grief who developed a set of coping mechanisms that are damaging to everyone in his orbit, including himself. The harm is real, but the intent is not malicious in the way a conventional villain's is. Rick does not destroy civilizations because he wants them destroyed. He destroys them incidentally, as a byproduct of pursuing other goals, in the same way that a person in deep emotional pain sometimes damages relationships not because they want the relationship gone, but because the pain makes it impossible to act with the care the relationship requires. Scale Rick's version of that dynamic to a genius with a portal gun and interdimensional access, and the damage becomes civilizational, but the underlying mechanism is recognizable. Season 4's episode centering on Tony and the private toilet captured the defense's strongest case. Rick's behavior throughout that episode was petty and aggressive, motivated by a territorial instinct that the show treated as comic. But the ending, with Rick sitting alone in his shame trap, being mocked by his own recordings after attending the funeral of a stranger he had never been able to admit he respected, staged something that pure villainy cannot produce. A genuine villain feels nothing sitting in that garage. What the show showed instead was a person whose cruelty was always the outer layer of something else, something more confused and more painful and more human than cruelty for its own sake. The Pissmaster episode in Season 6 added its own piece to this. Rick, having humiliated a man called the Pissmaster in a conflict that contributed to the man's suicide, assumed the Pissmaster's identity for a period as a form of atonement. He did not announce the atonement or seek acknowledgement for it. He simply inhabited the dead man's role and tried to give that role a more honorable ending than the one the original occupant had received. The gesture was quiet, private, and completely inconsistent with the behavior of someone who simply did not care about the consequences of their actions. Rick cared. He had always cared. The 7 million crimes and the Cronenberg dimension and the garage plan from Season 3 coexisted, in the same person, with the capacity for that kind of wordless, reparative act. What the villain theory ultimately surfaces is not a conclusion, but a question the show has been asking since its earliest episodes. The question is not whether Rick is a villain in the conventional sense. He clearly is not. in the sense that his harm is incidental rather than organized, and his capacity for genuine care is real and documented. The question is whether the narrative frame that treats him as a hero is honest, and whether the genre conventions of the lovable rogue who breaks rules and produces chaos but ultimately means well are adequate to account for the actual scale of what Rick Sanchez has done and left behind him across several decades and countless dimensions. Evil Morty thought the frame was dishonest. He had lived inside it long enough to map every wall, and what he found when he mapped it was a prison that looked like an adventure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The villain theory holds up better than the show's framing typically acknowledges, which says something about how carefully the show has constructed its own protective narrative around Rick. Next, the theory about how Rick cheats death, the body-hopping experiment that went wrong, and what it means for the question of whether the Rick currently running the adventures is still the same one who started them. Section 6. The Operation Phoenix Theory. Rick Sanchez has died multiple times across the run of Rick and Morty, and has come back from each death without meaningful interruption to his ongoing existence. The Season 4 premiere made this explicit when Morty accidentally killed Rick early in the episode, and a holographic version of Rick appeared immediately to walk Morty through the revival process. But understanding how that system works, what its limits are, and what it costs Rick in ways the show does not always foreground, requires going back 2 seasons to a quieter introduction buried inside an episode remembered primarily for something else entirely. The mechanism was introduced in Season 2, in an episode remembered primarily for a very different reason. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez is the episode in which Rick transfers his consciousness into a teenage clone of himself to help his grandchildren deal with a vampire at their school. The young clone, given the name Tiny Rick by the students who love him immediately, becomes a social phenomenon. He is charming, physically capable, emotionally accessible, and free of the decades of accumulated damage that make the original Rick so difficult to be around. The school adores him, Summer and Morty adore him, and inside the teenage body, the original Rick is dying. The young brain's personality begins overriding the old consciousness. The Rick being processed through a teenage nervous system is being slowly replaced by the experience of being a teenager. And what is dissolving in the process is everything that makes Rick Rick. He communicates his distress to his grandchildren through the songs Tiny Rick performs, which carry an emotional weight and a desperation completely inconsistent with the cheerful surface persona. Morty eventually recognizes the signal, Summer is persuaded, and together they force Tiny Rick back into the preservation chamber where the original body waits. Rick emerges. He is himself again. And in the aftermath of the experience, he announces that Operation Phoenix is not the failsafe he thought it would be, and destroys his underground storage facility of clone bodies in various stages of development with an axe. The destruction of the clone facility was presented as a definitive ending. Rick had tried the system, found its central flaw, and dismantled it. Operation Phoenix, as a contingency plan for death, was over. 2 seasons later, it became clear that it was not over. The Season 4 premiere opens with Rick dying. Morty is flying their spacecraft, hits something, and Rick goes through the windshield at speed. The death is sudden and completely unglamorous, the kind of accident that happens not because of a villain or a crisis, but because someone was not wearing their seatbelt. A holographic version of Rick appears immediately to guide Morty through the steps of Operation Phoenix, explaining that the protocol will upload Rick's consciousness into a new clone body once Morty deposits a tissue sample into a cloning machine. Morty, occupied with his own situation involving a death crystal and a vision of himself dying with the girl he loves, refuses to complete the process for an extended period of time. Rick remains dead. The hologram continues offering guidance while Morty pursues his own agenda. What happens next is where the theory becomes genuinely interesting. Rick's consciousness, with no viable clone body in his own dimension because he destroyed those years earlier, does not simply stop. It reroutes. The system, apparently, is not limited to clones in a single dimension. Operation Phoenix, as Rick designed it, was a personal backup limited to his own universe. But across the multiverse, alternate versions of Rick had independently developed their own Operation Phoenix systems, and those systems were running. Rick's dying consciousness, finding no local receptacle, transferred into the nearest available clone across dimensional lines, waking up in a body prepared by a Rick he had never met in a dimension he had never visited. The first body was Fascist Rick's, then Shrimp Rick's, then Teddy Bear Rick's, then Wasp Rick's. Each jump deposited Rick's consciousness in a new alternate body in a new alternate dimension, and each dimension came, as Rick himself noted with dark resignation, with a fascist dystopia already installed as the default setting. The joke was that the multiverse apparently runs fascist by default whenever Rick is not around to disrupt it. The implication was that Rick, for all his crimes, functions as a kind of chaotic corrective to organized authoritarianism wherever he lands. Not because he opposes it philosophically, but because he opposes being told what to do by anyone under any circumstances, which produces the same practical result. After navigating through several bodies and several dimensions, Rick eventually made it back to his own universe, with the help of a benevolent Wasp Rick who retained enough decency to assist rather than exploit. He returned to find Morty still managing the Death Crystal situation and the original clone body still waiting to be activated. The adventure of the premiere was structured as comedy, with the parade of alternate Ricks played for escalating absurdity. But underneath the comedy, the episode had established something with significant implications for the rest of the series. Rick can survive his own death. Not metaphorically, not with a long recovery period, not through the intervention of another character making a sacrifice. He survives it automatically, through a contingency system that spans multiple dimensions and activates without conscious input from him. The destruction of his original clone facility did not end Operation Phoenix. It ended his local version of it. The broader multiversal network of alternate Rick clone systems remained active, and the network had him covered. The philosophical question the theory focuses on is what this means for the continuity of Rick's identity. Personal identity under conditions of consciousness transfer is a problem that philosophy has examined in various forms for a long time, and the specific version of it that Rick and Morty stages is one of the cleanest thought experiments available in contemporary fiction. When Rick's consciousness transferred out of his original body and into Fascist Rick's clone, the body he occupied was not his own. It had been grown in a different dimension by a different Rick to serve as that Rick's contingency. Its genetic material was Rick's because all Ricks share the same genetic template, but its specific biological history was not. The brain Rick woke up in had been developing inside a facility operated by someone else. The physical substrate of his consciousness had changed entirely. The Ship of Theseus problem asks whether an object that has had all of its component parts replaced over time remains the same object. Applied to Rick, the question becomes whether a consciousness that is passed through multiple bodies across multiple dimensions remains the same consciousness in any meaningful sense. Rick's memories were intact across the transfers. His personality survived, which was the opposite of what happened to Tiny Rick, where the body's developmental state began overwriting the consciousness rather than hosting it. The Season 4 body hopping maintained the person while changing everything physical about him. Whether that is sufficient for identity continuity is exactly the question the theory finds most generative. The Season 3 premiere had already staged an adjacent version of this question, though the framing was different. Rick's imprisonment by the Galactic Federation began with his consciousness being extracted from his original body and placed inside a series of different bodies as his captors attempted to extract the portal gun formula from different angles. The consciousness moved, adapted, maneuvered, and ultimately escaped by jumping into a specific body at a specific moment in a coordinated plan. The sequence demonstrated that Rick's self-model is not body-dependent. He does not experience the loss of his body as the loss of himself. His identity is portable in a way that most people's is not, and he has known this and planned around it for long enough that the planning has become infrastructure. What the theory develops from this established fact is a question about the Rick the audience is currently following. The first season of Rick and Morty presented Rick C137 as a specific person in a specific body who had lived a specific life. By the end of Season 3, that specific person had passed through multiple bodies across multiple dimensions and returned to something approximating his original biological configuration through a process that involved dying, being replaced by external factors, and re-inhabiting a cloned body rather than his original one. By the Season 4 premiere, he had done it again and again and again in rapid succession, each time waking up in a body that was not the one he had occupied when the episode started. The question of whether a person who has transferred their consciousness multiple times through cloned bodies in alternate dimensions is still the same person who began the series is not rhetorical. The show does not ask it directly, but it has assembled all the conditions required to take it seriously. Rick treats himself as continuous. His memories tell him he is the same entity who lived in dimension C137 with Diane and Beth, who hunted Rick Prime for decades, who helped build the Citadel and then abandoned it. But memories are not bodies, and bodies are not nothing. The specific biological configuration of a brain shapes the consciousness it hosts in ways that neuroscience documents and that the show itself acknowledged in the Tiny Rick episode, where a young body's developmental state was sufficient to begin eroding a decades-old personality. The clone bodies Rick has occupied since then were all grown to adult specifications that matched his original configuration, which presumably avoids the developmental override problem. But the tissue they were grown from and the dimensional histories they developed within were not his. The cybernetic enhancement theory adds another layer. From Season 3 onward, Rick displays technological modifications that were not visible in the earlier seasons. An arm gun built into his body, various other embedded tools and devices. The in-universe explanation that received the most attention was that Rick acquired these modifications during the Season 3 premiere's body jumping sequence, inheriting them from one of the bodies he temporarily occupied. If modifications can be inherited across body transfers, then the Rick who emerged from the Season 3 premiere was not simply the same Rick restored to his original state. He was a composite, a consciousness in a body that had absorbed physical characteristics from at least one other dimensional variant. The Rick who woke up in the Season 3 premiere's final body carried something from the journey that the Rick who began it did not have. Memory Rick introduces a different version of the same problem. Surfacing in Season 5's Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, Memory Rick was a specific iteration of Rick's consciousness that had been living inside Bird Person's mind, preserved there from a period in their shared history. When Rick entered Bird Person's mind to attempt a rescue, he encountered a version of himself that had been developing independently inside another person's subconscious, shaped by Bird Person's memory and interpretation of their relationship rather than by Rick's own continuous experience. By Season 7, following the events of The Jarek Trap, Memory Rick ended up trapped inside Jerry's mind, where, as of the show's current run, he has apparently survived for 2 years in a cognitive environment about as far from his original context as anything in the show has staged. A version of Rick's consciousness is living inside Jerry's brain. Whatever that experience is doing to Memory Rick, it is happening to an entity that shares Rick's baseline but has been developing in isolation from him for years. The question of whether Memory Rick is Rick, a Rick, or something that used to be Rick and has since become something adjacent, is one the show has not yet answered. Operation Phoenix's most direct statement on the identity question came through Rick Prime's death in Season 7. Evil Morty, before allowing Rick C137 to kill Rick Prime, deleted Rick Prime's body backup drive. The deletion was deliberate and specific. Evil Morty wanted Rick Prime dead in a way that could not be undone by the same contingency systems that had kept Rick C137 running across multiple deaths. The implication was that without a backup drive, the death was final, which means that with a backup drive, it would not have been. Rick Prime, for all of his destructiveness, was operating the same general framework Rick C137 had developed. Consciousness as transferable data, stored separately from the body housing it, available for reinstallation if the current installation was destroyed. The backup drive's deletion was Evil Morty acknowledging that the system Rick had built for himself was the same system that made his enemy functionally immortal, and that killing Rick Prime meaningfully required dismantling that system rather than simply destroying the body. The theory's fullest implication is that Rick Sanchez, as currently running, may be the most durable entity in the show's universe, not because his biology is exceptional, but because his contingency architecture is. He is planned around death the way other people plan around inconvenience. The grief and the nihilism and the drinking that define his personality operate within a framework that has quietly removed the one thing that normally provides a floor for nihilism to bounce off. A person who truly believes nothing matters and has also made it structurally very difficult for themselves to die is running an interesting contradiction. The meaninglessness of existence is easier to perform when the performance cannot be permanently interrupted. Whether Rick knows that about himself, whether the immortality architecture was built out of fear rather than strategy, whether some part of him suspects that the endless contingency planning is itself a form of the control-seeking that underlies the Citadel and the Curve and the Morty relationship, is a question the theory raises without resolving. The show has not resolved it either, which is perhaps the most honest thing it could do with a character built entirely around the gap between what he performs and what he feels. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Operation Phoenix raises the question of whether the Rick running the show is still the original one, and the answer may be more complicated than a simple yes or no. Next, the theory about how Rick became the Rickest Rick, the war he waged against himself across the multiverse, and why only one specific kind of grief could have produced him. Section 7. The Rickest Rick Theory. Every Rick across the central finite curve is, by definition, the smartest being in the universe they inhabit. The curve was built to guarantee that. Step into any dimension within its boundaries, and the Rick operating there sits at the top of the cognitive hierarchy, uncontested, separated from everyone else by a gap wide enough that the separation feels less like an advantage and more like a condition of existence. Being a Rick means being the most capable thing in the room, in the city, on the planet, in the galaxy. It is the one constant across infinite variations of the same person, the trait that survives every difference in circumstance, personality, history, and choice. All Ricks are geniuses. All Ricks are the smartest. All Ricks are, within the logic of the curve, essentially equivalent at the top of the same hierarchy. Except one. The label the Rickest Rick belongs specifically to Rick C137, and it was applied to him by the Council of Ricks as a designation that carried both recognition and resentment. The Council used it when placing him on trial in Season 1, framing it as an accusation as much as a title. The Rickest Rick was their name for a Rick who had exceeded whatever the standard version of being a Rick amounted to, who had become something the other Ricks could not fully account for and could not comfortably contain. The phrase sounds like a superlative in a category that already contains only exceptional members. Understanding what it actually means requires going back to the period before the Citadel existed, when Rick C137 was moving through the multiverse alone, and understanding what he was doing and why only a Rick who had experienced exactly what he had experienced could have done it. Rick Prime invented interdimensional portal travel first. That fact is confirmed and not contested within the show's canon. Rick Prime was the first being in any dimension to crack the mathematics of moving between realities and build a working portal gun. He then traveled the multiverse, visiting alternate versions of himself and distributing the technology, not out of generosity, but out of a specific kind of contempt. Rick Prime had abandoned his own family without apparent difficulty and found the infinite multiverse more interesting than domestic life. His tour of alternate Ricks was a recruitment drive framed as an invitation, and his response to being refused by Rick C-137 was to send a bomb through a portal and kill the family the refusing Rick had chosen over the offer. The refusal was not simply a no, it was, from Rick Prime's perspective, a verdict. Rick C-137 had looked at everything the multiverse could offer and chosen a wife and a daughter over it, which Rick Prime experienced as a judgment against the choice he himself had made. The bomb was the retaliation of a person who could not tolerate the implication. Rick C-137 survived. He spent time grieving. Then he built a portal gun independently, from scratch, working from the same foundational mathematics that Rick Prime had started from, arriving at the same breakthrough through his own unassisted reasoning. The show confirmed this in Season 6. Rick C-137 and Rick Prime were the only two beings across all of the multiverse who independently invented interdimensional portal travel. Every other Rick who had portal technology received it from Rick Prime's distribution tour. Rick C-137 received nothing and built the same thing anyway, motivated not by curiosity or ambition, but by the specific, practical need of a grieving man who wanted to find the person responsible for his family's deaths and could not do so without the ability to travel between dimensions. The significance of this detail is not primarily technical. It is characterological. Rick Prime invented portal travel because he was Rick Prime, because his intelligence had no competing emotional priority and could devote itself entirely to the problem. Rick C-137 invented portal travel because his family was murdered and he needed a way to pursue the murderer. He arrived at the same destination through a completely different kind of motivation. Where Rick Prime's genius expressed itself naturally, in the absence of anything that mattered more, Rick C-137's genius was forced into expression by grief and redirected entirely toward a single purpose. The show has noted, through multiple characters and contexts, that C-137 is understood within the Rick community as the Rickest Rick, precisely because he did not actually choose science. He chose his family. When that choice was taken from him, science became the only remaining instrument. A Rick who found his way to the multiverse through love rather than ambition is a different kind of Rick than one who found it through intellect alone. And the difference turns out to matter enormously. The hunt for Rick Prime consumed decades and became a war. During the years between Diane and Beth's murders and Rick's eventual arrival at Beth's house, he traversed the multiverse searching for the specific Rick who had destroyed his family. The search was complicated by the fundamental problem of identifying Rick Prime in a multiverse full of Ricks. Every Rick he encountered who was not Rick Prime was a potential obstacle, a potential source of information, or a potential mistake. Some of those Ricks were members of an organized group, apparently connected to Rick Prime's early network of portal technology recipients, who opposed Rick C-137's search for reasons that were never made entirely explicit. Rick killed them. He killed others whose connection to the original organization was unclear. He killed Ricks who came after him preemptively, Ricks who had decided that a roving C-137 was a threat to be eliminated before he became their problem. He firebombed an assembly of Ricks who had gathered to organize an offensive against him, dropping explosives on a meeting that likely contained Ricks who had no personal history with him at all beyond the fact of his reputation. The mathematics of what Rick did during this period is staggering when examined directly. He killed hundreds of alternate versions of himself. He did this while grieving, while drinking, while losing faith incrementally in his ability to ever find the specific target he was looking for. The other Ricks, who were not Rick Prime, were not innocent in any pure sense, since many of them had organized against him. But they were also not the person who had killed his family. They were the people who happened to share his face in dimensions he passed through on the way to someone he never found. He killed them anyway, not because he had resolved some moral question about their culpability, But because the grief and the momentum of the search and the drinking had all merged into something that no longer required a clear answer to the question of whether a given Rick deserved what was coming to him. The other Ricks eventually recognized that they could not win. This is the fact that the Rickest Rick designation was originally responding to. Across the multiverse, where every Rick was by definition the most capable entity in their universe, they had collectively attempted to stop a single Rick and failed. Their failure was not close. Rick C-137 defeated every organized effort against him without being stopped or even significantly slowed. When the surrender came, it came with an offer rather than a demand. Instead of continuing to fight a war they had no path to winning, the surviving Ricks proposed a structure. They would build something together, a shared space, a civilizational infrastructure for Ricks and their Mortys, a place where the collective intelligence of infinite Rick variants could be organized into something more stable than a multiverse of isolated geniuses each running their own operation alone. Rick C-137 would be their leader. The Citadel of Ricks emerged from that negotiation. Its founding document, written in the practical terms of a peace agreement, established the Council of Ricks as a governing body and created the physical space of the Citadel itself, a vast interdimensional station housing countless Rick and Morty variants within a society organized around the specific needs and tendencies of its population. Rick C-137 was instrumental in its construction, and then, as the show confirmed in the Season 5 finale, left before it was completed. He helped build the Citadel and abandoned it, which established the pattern that would define his relationship to every institution he subsequently encountered. He was constitutionally incapable of remaining inside a structure he had helped create, because the act of creation was always in service of something else. And once that something else was either achieved or abandoned, the structure became a constraint rather than a tool. The Citadel that Rick left behind became, in his absence, something he would have found intolerable. Its society stratified rapidly along lines that mirrored the worst tendencies of the Rick personality writ large. An aristocracy of Ricks dominating a working class of Mortys. The Mortys exploited for their brainwave utility and their labor, while being told that their association with Ricks was a privilege rather than a condition of servitude. The Ricklantis Mix-Up episode staged a full portrait of this society and found it deeply, systematically unjust in ways that ran directly counter to the stated principles of a civilization built on intelligence. The smartest beings in their respective universes had created a caste system that would have been recognizable and unremarkable in any human society throughout history. The intelligence had not produced wisdom. It had produced a more efficiently organized version of the same hierarchies that intelligence, in Rick's worldview, was supposed to render obsolete. Rick C-137's distance from the Citadel after its founding was not indifference to what it became. His relationship with the Council of Ricks across the show's run was consistently antagonistic, characterized by the Council viewing him as an unpredictable element, and Rick viewing the Council as a bureaucracy of his own worst tendencies made administrative. He killed the Council of Ricks in Season 3 when they interfered with his dismantling of the Galactic Federation, eliminating the governing body of the civilization he had founded with the same efficiency he had brought to eliminating the Ricks who had opposed him during the hunt for Rick Prime. The Citadel elected a new government. Rick had nothing to do with that process either. What the Rickest Rick designation ultimately describes, when the full history behind it is laid out, is not a Rick who is simply smarter than other Ricks. Technically, within the central finite curve, all Ricks are the smartest being in their universe, so raw intelligence alone cannot account for the gap. What it describes is a Rick whose intelligence was sharpened and directed by a specific kind of loss, and who then applied that sharpened intelligence to a purpose that no other Rick had faced and survived. Every other Rick across the curve received portal technology as a gift from Rick Prime's distribution tour. Rick C-137 developed it independently in order to pursue his wife's killer. Every other Rick who formed the original network of portal users benefited from Rick Prime's willingness to share. Rick C-137 was the one Rick Prime had specifically tried to kill rather than recruit. The asymmetry of that history meant that Rick C-137 approached the multiverse with a relationship to it that no other Rick had. Not as a gift, not as an invitation, not as the natural extension of his genius into an appropriate arena, but as the terrain across which a war was being conducted and would eventually be resolved. The theory built around this history proposes that what made Rick C-137 the Rickest Rick was not any innate superiority of his intelligence over that of other Ricks, but rather the fact that his intelligence had been deployed under conditions that forced it to develop in directions that peacetime genius does not explore. A Rick who received portal technology, who joined the early network on friendly terms, who traveled the multiverse in a state of relative security, never had to develop the specific capacities required to survive a multiverse-wide war against organized opposition. Rick C-137 had to develop those capacities because the alternative was dying or giving up the search. The war forged a specific kind of mind, one that the other Ricks had never been required to produce and could not replicate simply by applying the intelligence they had always had to the same problems. Dan Harmon confirmed an adjacent version of this through a comment about the nature of the Rickest Rick designation. The argument, as Harmon framed it, was that being the Rickest Rick required a specific kind of self-destructiveness, the willingness to pursue a purpose at costs that a rational actor would find unacceptable. Rick C-137 killed hundreds of Ricks who were not his target, lost decades to a search that consistently failed, drank himself into a state of accelerating deterioration, and kept going through all of it not because the math supported continuing, but because the grief left him no other available direction. A Rick whose intelligence operated without that kind of grief-driven irrationality would have run the calculation at some point and concluded that the search was no longer worth the cost. Rick C-137 ran the calculation and kept going anyway, because the calculation was not actually what was driving the search. Something older and less rational than calculation was driving it. The genius was in service of the grief, not the other way around. And that inversion produced a kind of person the other Ricks had never encountered, and had no framework for defeating. The Citadel's later history adds a coda to the theory that the show staged through Evil Morty rather than through Rick directly. Evil Morty, rising to the presidency of the Citadel through a campaign that presented itself as reformist while pursuing a completely different agenda, ultimately destroyed the Citadel and broke the central finite curve. What he needed to accomplish that destruction was the specific knowledge inside Rick C-137's brain, the understanding of the curve's architecture that only its founder possessed. The civilization Rick built and abandoned was ultimately dismantled using information that only he had. The Rickest Rick, who had walked away from the institution he founded, remained the critical variable in its eventual dissolution decades later. Not because he had planned for that outcome, but because everything he had built during the worst period of his life was uniquely entangled with everything he had subsequently tried to leave behind. The Rickest Rick is not the smartest Rick in the way that the label, taken literally, suggests. He is the Rick whose intelligence was tested in a specific way that no other Rick's was, forged by a specific loss that no other Rick survived in the same configuration, and deployed toward a purpose that left its mark on every system he touched. The other Ricks recognized this without fully understanding it, which is why their recognition took the form of a title that expressed both honor and resentment. They were acknowledging something they could not replicate and could not entirely explain, conceding a superiority they experienced as a fact of encounter without being able to account for it in their own terms. What they were actually acknowledging, though none of them would have said it this way, was that the Rickest Rick was the one who had loved something more than his own intelligence, and lost it. and then aimed his intelligence at the loss for the rest of his life. Every other Rick had always put the intelligence first. Only one had learned, too late and at enormous cost, what it felt like to put it second. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Rickest Rick became what he is because grief pointed his intelligence somewhere it had never been pointed before. Next, the theory that everything visible about Rick, the nihilism, the cruelty, the performed indifference, is not his personality at all, but the armor he built to protect what is actually underneath it. Section 8. The Secret Soft Side Theory. Rick Sanchez spent the first 2 seasons of Rick and Morty presenting as a man who genuinely did not care. About his family, about the consequences of his actions, about the people damaged in the course of his adventures, about his own survival. The show built its early identity partly around that presentation, using the performed indifference as both a comedic engine and a character baseline. What the evidence accumulated across 8 seasons reveals is that the nihilism and the cruelty and the drinking were not a personality, but a construction, built specifically to keep the actual version of Rick Sanchez hidden from a universe that had already demonstrated, once and catastrophically, what it was willing to take from him the moment he stopped hiding. The first signal arrived in the Season 1 finale, embedded inside a house party scene that was playing primarily as comedy. Morty, struggling to make sense of Rick's behavior across the episodes leading up to that point, found Bird Person and asked for context. Bird Person had known Rick longer than anyone else the show had introduced, and what he offered Morty was not an explanation so much as a translation key. He said that in his culture, the way Rick behaved, the burping, the apparent intoxication, the chaotic and frequently self-destructive choices, communicated something specific. The translation was, "This person is in great pain." Bird Person was not describing a man who had built a personality around pain as an aesthetic choice. He was describing a man whose pain was so constant and so deep that it had restructured the way he communicated, replacing direct expression with behavior that those who knew the code could read, and those who did not would simply experience as character. Rick could not say the thing. He had developed an entire system for saying it sideways, and the system was old enough and well-practiced enough that most people never looked past it to what it was translating. The episode that confirmed what the translation key was pointing toward arrived at the end of Season 2. Autoerotic assimilation was centered on Rick's history with Unity, a hive-mind entity capable of absorbing and controlling entire planetary populations. The depth of Rick's connection to Unity was established through the recklessness with which he engaged with something that powerful, the way his usual careful maneuvering gave way to something more abandoned and less controlled. Unity eventually left again, as it had left before, communicating through a note that Rick's self-destructive nature made genuine closeness with him impossible over time. Rick absorbed the rejection alone, in his garage. Then he pressed a weapon against his own head. The show did not frame the moment with dramatic music or narrative urgency. No one was watching. No other character entered the scene to interrupt or witness. The only reason Rick survived was that the alcohol brought him down before he could act. The episode ended there, and the following episode began without direct reference to what had closed the previous one. The restraint of the staging was itself a statement. A man performing nihilism as a genuine philosophical position does not end an evening alone in a garage with a weapon aimed at himself. Nihilism, lived authentically, produces indifference rather than despair. Despair requires caring about something and finding it absent. What the scene showed was a person who had reached towards something real, been refused, and found the resulting emptiness unbearable. The armor does not produce that moment. Only what the armor is protecting can produce that moment. Season 3 provided the theory's most structurally explicit confirmation through an episode that has been discussed primarily in terms of its comedy, but contains something more serious in its mechanics. The Whirly-Durly conspiracy sent Rick and Jerry on an adventure together, and during that adventure, an alien device separated Rick's consciousness into two independently operating components: his intelligence and his emotional interior, each running without the management of the other. The emotional component of Rick, freed from the intelligent component's continuous suppression, spoke in ways the integrated version of Rick had never allowed. It described Morty with a tenderness and a vulnerability that were completely absent from Rick's normal register. It did not sound like a different person. It sounded like the same person operating without the filter that usually processed every genuine feeling into something unrecognizable before it could reach expression. The significance of that scene is not that Rick has feelings, which the show had been implying from its earliest episodes. The significance is what the split reveals about the continuous labor involved in maintaining the armor. Rick's intelligence was not simply coexisting with his emotional interior across his daily life. It was actively managing it, moment by moment, intercepting what the emotional interior produced and converting it into something that fit the performance. The split made that management visible by removing it. When the intelligence was no longer available to perform the conversion, the emotional interior spoke plainly. Put back together, Rick reassembled the armor and the management resumed. But the split had provided a brief and unambiguous look at what the intelligence had been working to contain. The Season 2 finale staged Rick's love for the Smith family through the frame of strategy, which is how Rick always stages genuine feeling when he cannot avoid expressing it. Surrendering himself to the Galactic Federation to remove the threat his presence posed to Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty, Rick maintained the exterior of a man executing a plan rather than making a sacrifice. The Season 3 premiere confirmed that the plan was real, that the surrender was tactical, and that Rick had been working toward a specific outcome from inside his prison cell. But the speech he gave before surrendering, telling the family that they would be better off without him, carried an emotional weight that pure tactics did not require. A man executing a scheme with no genuine feeling attached to its human elements does not need to speak to those elements about their well-being before leaving. The statement served no strategic function. Rick said it because it was true, and because the tactical frame provided just enough cover for the truth to pass through without being identified as such. Morty specifically generated the most extended and most consistent body of evidence across the show's full run. During the Season 1 episode involving Evil Rick and the Morty Matrix, Morty was captured and subjected to a brain scan intended to extract navigational data. What the scan surfaced instead was a memory of Rick holding Morty as an infant, looking at the baby with an expression the show staged as tearful. Evil Rick observed this and responded with contempt, characterizing Rick's attachment to Morty as irrational, an error in an otherwise functional system. The contempt was revealing in its own way. Evil Rick, a version of Rick operating without the suppression that C-137 maintained, had eliminated the emotional interior rather than managed it. Finding evidence of that interior in another Rick registered to him as a defect, which confirmed that the capacity Evil Rick had removed was the same capacity C-137 was hiding. The attachment was real. The memory was real. The tears were real. Rick had been caught experiencing something genuine in a context where no performance was running, and the evidence was pulled out of his brain by a scanner rather than offered by his own choosing. The Season 6 episode in which Rick assumed the identity of the Pissmaster offered the softest and most private version of this argument. Rick had been involved, indirectly but meaningfully, in a sequence of events that contributed to the Pissmaster's suicide. Rather than process this as collateral damage in an indifferent universe, which the performed version of Rick would have done without difficulty, he took the dead man's identity and attempted to give the Pissmaster's superhero career an ending more honorable than the one it had received. The gesture was conducted entirely without witness. Nobody saw Rick doing it as an act of care rather than as another adventure. He wore a disguise specifically, a costume within a costume, the emotional act concealed inside a layer of role-playing that gave the caring thing an alternative explanation if anyone happened to notice. That layering is Rick's characteristic method for every emotionally significant action in his life. He does the caring thing, and he does it inside a frame that allows the caring to be attributed to something else, something tactical or strategic or coincidental, so that the armor remains intact even as the interior quietly acts in ways the armor was supposedly preventing. The confirmation that Rick had been visiting alternate versions of Diane across the multiverse in the period before Rick Prime used the Omega device to erase her from every dimension resolved a question the earlier seasons had left open. Rick had not simply accepted the loss of Diane and organized his life around the absence. He had found her, or the closest available approximation of her, in dimensions where the bomb had never arrived because Rick Prime had never visited them. Those women were not Diane C-137. They shared her name and her face, and presumably something of her personality. And Rick knew the whole time that they were not the person he had lost. He visited them anyway. A man who genuinely felt nothing about his dead wife would have had no reason to locate her alternate counterparts across the multiverse and spend time with them. The visits were private, conducted without the knowledge of the Smith family or any other ongoing relationship in Rick's life. They were the most honest thing he was doing, and they were hidden from everyone. Rick Prime learned about the visits and used the Omega device in response. The weapon's function was the erasure of a target from every dimension simultaneously, removing every version of a person from all of existence in a single act. Aimed at Diane, it erased not just the alternate Dianes Rick had been visiting, but every Diane in every universe, eliminating even the possibility of finding another version of her anywhere across the entirety of infinity. Rick Prime chose this weapon for this target for a reason that was not strategic. He had identified what Rick valued most and demonstrated his willingness to destroy it completely and permanently. The fact that Rick Prime knew the Diane visits were happening and knew they were the thing that would cause maximum pain tells a story about what those visits represented. A grief that has been running privately for decades, organized around a specific person, sustained by visits to approximate versions of that person across the multiverse, is not the grief of a man who stopped caring. It is the grief of a man who never stopped, and found the only available method of managing it that did not require pretending it was not there. The progression across the show's later seasons showed the armor developing cracks rather than resolving cleanly. Season 6 staged Rick doing unambiguously good things with no tactical benefit attached to them, engaging in acts of ordinary care that the earlier seasons would have wrapped in ironic framing or deflected before they could register as genuine. The episode where Rick assumed the Pissmaster's identity was part of this shift, but so were smaller moments of directness with family members, instances of Rick allowing warmth to sit in a scene without immediately converting it into something else. The progression was not linear. The deflections and the cruelty and the performed indifference continued appearing alongside the moments of greater openness, because a person with Rick's history and Rick's armor does not move toward emotional honesty in a straight line. They move toward it the way someone moves through a space they have not occupied in a long time, capable of genuine presence in one moment and full retreat in the next, with neither the presence nor the retreat canceling the other out. What the theory is ultimately describing is a man whose emotional interior is neither dead nor dormant, but continuously active, continuously generating things that require management, and continuously being managed by an intelligence that has devoted enormous resources to the project of keeping those things from being visible. The nihilism is the primary instrument of that management. Declare nothing matters, and the things that matter most are protected by the declaration. Because caring about something in a nihilistic universe is an individual error rather than a universal truth, and individual errors can be dismissed rather than engaged. The cruelty toward the people closest to him serves a parallel function, maintaining the performance of distance from people he cannot afford to be close to, without risking what closeness costs him. The drinking gives the entire system a chemical floor, reducing the sharpness of what the emotional interior produces to a level the management system can handle. Rick Sanchez is not a man with a hidden soft side sitting intact and preserved underneath the armor waiting to be discovered. He is a man whose emotional interior has been compressed and worked on and shaped by decades of suppression. And what lives there is real and genuine, but also marked by everything that has been done to it. The love is real. The grief is real. The capacity for connection, demonstrated across enough moments, across enough seasons, to constitute a pattern rather than an exception, is real. What the armor has done to all of that across the decades of its operation is the question the show has been staging without always naming directly. And the answer the evidence suggests is that the armor did not kill what it was protecting. It bent it into shapes that require more effort to recognize, and it produced a man who has extraordinary difficulty being the person his own interior is trying to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The armor and what it protects have been the show's quiet subject from the beginning, running underneath every adventure and every crisis. Next, the theory that Rick and Morty's central relationship is stranger and older than it appears, and asks whether Morty's future and Rick's past might be the same story told in opposite directions. Section 9. The Rick is Morty theory. The theory that Morty Smith grows up to become Rick Sanchez has been circulating in the Rick and Morty fan community since the show's earliest seasons, and it starts with a detail from the pilot that most viewers processed as a throwaway moment. When Morty's Mega Seed enhancement wore off at the end of the first episode, he drooled, uncontrollably, for an extended period, in a way the show played as comedy, but which connected directly to something persistent about Rick's own presentation throughout the series. Rick drools too. He always has. And the theory asks whether that shared symptom is the first visible piece of a much larger structural argument about who these two characters actually are in relation to each other. The theory, stated plainly, is that Morty Smith grows up to become Rick Sanchez. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that Morty will develop similar traits over time, but literally. The teenager currently running adventures with his grandfather is the same person as that grandfather, separated by decades and the specific series of choices and losses that converted one into the other. The grandfather taking Morty on adventures is taking his own past self on adventures. The grandson watching Rick with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion is watching his own future with the same mixture. The version of this theory that circulated most widely in the show's early seasons was built around the mega seeds established in the pilot. Morty's brief intelligence enhancement and the drooling symptom that followed when the seeds wore off connected to Rick's persistent drooling in a way that suggested both characters were in some phase of the same biological relationship with the same substance. If Morty was the baseline version of a person who would eventually become dependent on mega seed enhancement to maintain a genius-level intellect, then Rick was the endpoint of that dependency, a version of the same person who had been running on chemical enhancement long enough that the drooling had become a permanent, low-level symptom rather than a temporary after-effect. The seeds tied their physiologies together in a way that pointed towards shared biology. Shared biology, in a time loop theory, is what would be expected between a person and an older version of that same person. The theory developed a secondary strand around the circumstances of Rick's return to Beth's family. Rick had been absent for approximately 20 years before the show's events began. The explanation for the return, offered in pieces across multiple seasons, was that Rick had settled in Rick Prime's original dimension after failing to locate Rick Prime directly, choosing to live adjacent to a version of the family he had lost rather than continue the search alone. That explanation is canon and confirmed. What the time loop theory found interesting was the specific nature of the return. Rick came back to a household that contained a Morty. His stated reasons for prioritizing Morty as a companion involved the brainwave mechanics discussed in an earlier section. But the emotional texture of his relationship with Morty from the pilot onward exceeded what a purely instrumental explanation accounted for. A man returning to a household specifically because it contains a version of himself at 14 years old, watched from the perspective of someone who remembers being that version, would relate to the younger person with exactly the mixture of protectiveness and condescension and investment that Rick demonstrates toward Morty across every season. The anime short that film theory pointed to as evidence in 2020 added a specific visual detail to the argument. The short depicted a sequence involving an older Morty and a younger Rick, staged in a way that suggested the relationship between the characters was not fixed to the positions they occupied in the main series. The short's canonicity is not established within the television series, and the show's creative team has not confirmed that the short's events represent anything binding within the main continuity. As a piece of evidence, it is suggestive rather than conclusive. But it demonstrated that the people responsible for producing Rick and Morty content were, at minimum, aware of the theory and comfortable staging material that played with its logic without committing to it as a confirmed reading. The strongest structural evidence for the theory does not come from any single scene or visual detail. It comes from the parallel construction of Rick and Morty's character arcs across the show's full run. Morty at the beginning of Season 1 is passive, reactive, easily overwhelmed, dependent on Rick's direction to navigate situations that exceed his limited experience. By Season 4, he is making independent decisions, developing strategies that occasionally exceed Rick's expectations, demonstrating a willingness to prioritize his own judgment over Rick's instructions in situations where he has concluded Rick's judgment is wrong. By Season 6 and 7, the gap between them has narrowed in specific ways that the show stages carefully. Not because Morty has become Rick's intellectual equal, which the show does not claim, but because Morty has absorbed enough of Rick's operational approach to the universe that he is no longer the helpless passenger he was at the beginning of the series. The direction of that development points somewhere. A version of Morty 10 or 20 years further along the same trajectory, having continued the adventures, having absorbed the experiences, having sustained the losses and the traumas and the accumulated weight of interdimensional travel across a significant portion of his adult life, would not be the nervous 14-year-old from the pilot. The question the time loop theory asks is whether the end point of that trajectory has a name the show has already given it. Rick's behavior toward Morty contains details that fit the theory in ways that are difficult to account for through any other explanation. His protectiveness of Morty, which runs beneath the surface of his cruelty and dismissiveness and surfaces in moments of genuine threat, operates with an intensity that the brainwave jammer utility alone cannot produce. A man who needed a neural mask would protect the tool the way a tradesperson protects an essential piece of equipment, carefully, practically, with an eye toward its continued functional usefulness. What Rick demonstrates toward Morty is something that looks less like equipment maintenance and more like the specific irrational investment that a person has toward their own past. He remembers what it cost him to be Morty. He knows what is coming. He cannot say any of this. And so it comes out sideways, as overprotectiveness in genuine danger, and as cruelty in the spaces between, which is a recognizable description of how a person who cannot tell a younger version of themselves what they know tends to behave around that younger version. The counter-evidence is substantial, and comes primarily from the show's confirmed canon, rather than from inference or structural analysis. Seasons 5 and 6 established Rick C-137's origin with a specificity that leaves limited room for a time loop explanation. Rick C-137 was a young man in dimension C-137 with a wife named Diane and a daughter named Beth when Rick Prime arrived and destroyed his family. He built a portal gun independently, hunted Rick Prime across the multiverse for decades, fought in a galactic revolution, helped found the Citadel, and eventually settled in Rick Prime's original dimension. That biography contains no point at which a younger Morty becomes an older Rick through a temporal mechanism. The origin was confirmed in conditions that rule out fabrication, during Evil Morty's brain scan, and the details are too specific and too thoroughly cross-referenced with other confirmed events to accommodate a time loop that would require Rick C137 to actually be an older Morty traveling backward. The theory's supporters have generally responded to this counter-evidence in one of two ways. The first acknowledges the confirmed canon and reclassifies the theory from literal to structural. Rick and Morty is not, in this reading, a literal time loop in which Morty and Rick are temporally identical. It is a story deliberately constructed so that the relationship between them mirrors the structure of a time loop without requiring the mechanics. Morty is who Rick was. Rick is who Morty is becoming. The show uses this parallel to explore what a person loses and gains across the decades that separate one version of themselves from another, using the science fiction frame to make the metaphor spatial rather than purely temporal. An older person watching their own youth from the outside, knowing what is coming and unable to change it, is an experience the show can stage directly by simply placing them in the same household and calling them grandfather and grandson. The second response focuses on Evil Morty as the theory's most interesting surviving variant. Evil Morty represents what a Morty who developed differently might become. A Morty who was pushed too far, too fast, who absorbed the operational logic of interdimensional travel without the protective layer of genuine care from a Rick who meant well, who eventually surpassed his Rick and turned that surplus capability against the entire system. Evil Morty's intelligence, his strategic patience, his ability to plan across multiple seasons toward a single outcome while presenting an entirely different surface to everyone around him are all qualities that the standard Morty of Season 1 would not appear capable of, and that the Rick archetype embodies as a baseline. Evil Morty is not Rick. He is a Morty who followed an accelerated version of the developmental trajectory that the time loop theory describes as Rick's, arriving at something Rick-adjacent through a different path and a different set of formative experiences. Evil Morty's explicit argument in the Season 5 finale that the Rick-Morty dynamic was a system of exploitation that kept Mortys trapped in a subordinate role for the functional benefit of Rick's was the argument of a person who had understood the system completely from the inside and concluded that the only rational response was to destroy it. A Morty who reached that conclusion and had the capacity to act on it had, in the relevant functional sense, become more Rick than most Ricks. He had done what Rick did, identified a structure, understood its mechanics, and decided to dismantle it because its continued existence was incompatible with his own goals. The method Evil Morty used, the patience, the constructed personas, the willingness to sacrifice enormous numbers of other beings in service of the long-term objective, bore no resemblance to the nervous teenager from Dimension C131 who had presumably been his starting point. Whatever Evil Morty had been before he became Evil Morty, the transformation was comprehensive. The Morty to Rick developmental arc, whether taken literally as a time loop or structurally as a parallel construction, surfaces most clearly in the show's treatment of the moment when Morty stops being purely reactive and begins operating with genuine strategic initiative. The Vat of Acid episode in Season 4 staged Morty executing a plan across an entire timeline specifically to win an argument with Rick, demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice real relationships and real experiences in service of a strategic objective that shocked even Rick with its cold completeness. The episode did not frame Morty's behavior as heroic or admirable. It staged it as disturbing, as evidence that Morty had internalized something from Rick that was not the part of Rick worth internalizing. A Morty who would do what Morty did in that episode had crossed a developmental line that the pilot version of the character could not have approached. He had learned to think the way Rick thinks, and the learning had cost something. That cost is the core of what the theory is tracking when it moves past the literal time loop mechanics into something more durable and more honest about what the show is actually doing with its two central characters. Rick and Morty are not the same person in different time periods, because the canon does not support that claim and the show has not staged it. What they are is a demonstration of what a specific kind of intelligence does to a person across time, shaped by the specific experiences that intelligence encounters and the specific losses it sustains. Rick is what Morty could become if the losses come heavily enough and the armor is built thoroughly enough and the years accumulate without anyone breaking through the defenses long enough to interrupt the process. The show is running both versions of the same basic human type simultaneously, one at the beginning of the story and one near what might be its end, and asking its audience to watch the younger one move, incrementally and unevenly, toward the older one, and to consider what that movement means. The time loop theory, in its literal form, is not confirmed, and the confirmed canon argues against it. As a structural reading of the show's central relationship, it describes something the show has been building since its pilot with more accuracy than most other frameworks available. Rick looks at Morty and sees something the show has never fully named. The most honest version of what he sees is probably the simplest: himself, at a distance that cannot be closed, moving towards something he cannot warn him about, in a story whose ending he already knows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of whether Morty's future and Rick's past are the same story has no clean answer, which is characteristic of everything the show leaves genuinely open. Next, what happened to Rick after he finally killed the man who destroyed his family? And the theory that the revenge was never going to be enough. Section 10. The Empty Purpose Theory. Season 7, Episode 5 of Rick and Morty is called Unmortrican, and it ends with Rick Sanchez covered in blood and viscera, standing over the remains of the person he had spent the better part of his adult life trying to find and kill. Rick Prime was dead. The revenge was complete. The defining mission of Rick C-137's existence, the purpose that had driven him to invent a portal gun, to wage a multiversal war against alternate versions of himself, to help build and then abandon the Citadel, to settle in a stranger's dimension pretending to be a family he had no biological claim to, the thing that had organized every significant decision he had made since a bomb came through a garage portal and killed the people he loved most, was finished. Rick had won. And the episode staged the aftermath of that win with a bleakness that made the victory feel like a different kind of loss. Dan Harmon spoke to Variety shortly after the episode aired, and what he described about Rick's state of mind in the wake of Rick Prime's death is the foundation of the theory this section examines. Harmon said that Rick was empty. Not relieved, not at peace, not free in the way that a person released from a decades-long obsession might reasonably be expected to feel. Empty. The word Harmon used was specific and deliberate, and it pointed toward something the show had been building toward without always naming directly. The possibility that Rick's revenge quest had not simply been a response to losing Diane and Beth, but had become, over the decades of its pursuit, the replacement for them. The mission had filled the space that the family once occupied. Completing the mission did not restore what the space had originally contained. It left the space visible again, in the same condition it had been in the moment the bomb hit. Except now, there was no longer even the forward momentum of the hunt to keep Rick from having to look at it directly. Harmon went further, describing Rick's self-destruction and his pursuit of vengeance as two expressions of the same underlying impulse. The narcissist, Harmon said, will tell you that destroying yourself does not solve the problem. Rick had spent decades in a state that looked from the outside like purposeful action, like a man with a goal and the intelligence and the will to pursue it across infinite dimensions, regardless of the cost. From the inside, Harmon suggested, it had always been running parallel to the suicide attempt at the end of Season 2. The hunt for Rick Prime was not simply grief expressed as mission. It was grief expressed as the most elaborate and extended version of self-harm available to a man with a portal gun and no reason to take care of himself. The theory built around this reading asks a question that the show had been quietly assembling the evidence for across its full run. What happens to a person when the thing that replaced everything they lost is taken away by being completed? Rick did not lose Rick Prime the way he lost Diane. He killed Rick Prime deliberately by his own hand in an act of final resolution. The replacement structure did not collapse or abandon him. He finished it. He was the one who ended the thing that had been keeping him organized since his 30s. And the ending left him standing in a room with nothing ahead of him that had the same weight or the same pull as what had just been resolved. The show's handling of the episodes following Unmortrican was itself a form of argument for the theory. Episode 6 of Season 7, Rick Fending Your Mort, moved forward without staging the emotional weight of what had just happened as its central concern. Rick questioned Morty's memories, an adventure occurred, a post-credits scene introduced something new. The show's episodic machinery reasserted itself over the dramatic territory the previous episode had opened. Many viewers experienced this as the show moving on too quickly from a landmark moment. The theory proposes that the show's pacing was doing something more intentional, staging the absence of purpose by filling the space where purpose had been with ordinary episodes, demonstrating through form rather than through dialogue what an empty Rick looks like from the outside. From the outside, he looks fine. He goes on adventures, he makes plans, he manages crises. The emptiness is not visible in behavior the way grief is visible in behavior. It is visible in the absence of the forward-leaning momentum that had characterized everything Rick did when the hunt was still running. Rick Prime himself had anticipated something like this, or had at least understood Rick well enough to know what completing the revenge would cost him. During their final confrontation, Rick Prime described Rick as someone defined entirely by his victimhood, calling him names that foregrounded his loss rather than his identity. The names were cruel and specific. Wife Guy, Dead Wife Rick. Rick Prime was doing what Rick Prime always did, weaponizing available information to cause maximum damage. But the names he chose revealed what he understood about the person he was facing. He understood that Rick C-137's identity had been constructed around the murders he had committed in Dimension C-137 all those decades ago. Remove the murders as the organizing fact of Rick's existence, which completing the revenge would accomplish, and what remained was a question Rick had not needed to answer since his early 30s. Evil Morty, returning an Unmortrican to assist in Rick Prime's defeat, demonstrated his own understanding of this dynamic through the terms of his involvement. He helped Rick kill Rick Prime, but he also collected something in the process, the schematics for the Omega device, the weapon that Rick Prime had used to erase Diane from every dimension simultaneously. Evil Morty left the confrontation holding the plans for the one weapon capable of doing to Rick what Rick Prime had done to Diane. The object capable of erasing Rick from all of infinity now existed in the hands of someone who had made it clear he would use it if Rick interfered with his life beyond the curve. Evil Morty gave Rick a leash, which was Harmon's description. Rick, in the aftermath of his victory, found himself held by something he had allowed to exist because some part of him was more invested in the possibility of his own destruction than in eliminating the threat. Harmon connected this directly to the nihilism and the self-destruction as parallel expressions of the same thing. The man who pressed a weapon against his head in the Season 2 garage had not resolved that impulse by finding and killing Rick Prime. He had transferred the instrument of potential self-annihilation to someone outside himself, which achieved roughly the same psychological effect while maintaining the appearance of having moved forward. The Season 7 finale, Fear No Mort, approached the empty purpose question from a different angle. The episode placed Rick and Morty inside a location that manifested each person's deepest fear. And the revelation about Rick's specific fear was not what the surface version of his character would predict. A man whose personality presents as indifferent to consequence, who has cheated death through Operation Phoenix enough times that death itself carries limited weight, whose nihilism frames all outcomes as equally meaningless, might be expected to fear nothing in a way that the fear-manifesting location would find professionally challenging. What the episode found instead was something older and more specific, oriented around loss and connection in ways that pointed directly back to the garage and everything that happened there. Rick's fear, examined in the context of the empty purpose theory, was not abstract. It was the fear of a person who had rebuilt a life around a purpose specifically to avoid having to feel what was underneath the purpose, and who had now completed that purpose and was left with the feeling unmediated for the first time in decades. The Omega device's erasure of Diane from every dimension added a dimension to the post-revenge emptiness that the theory finds essential. Rick had been visiting alternate Dianes across the multiverse during the years of the hunt, finding in those visits a private and partial form of the connection that the bomb had taken from him. Rick Prime's use of the Omega device removed not just Rick Prime's own Diane, but every Diane in existence, eliminating even the approximate version of the connection Rick had been sustaining himself with. By the time Rick killed Rick Prime, he had already lost Diane twice, once in the garage and once to the Omega device. The revenge resolved the second loss in the only way available, by removing the person responsible. But the first loss was not resolved by anything. It had simply been sitting there for decades, underneath the mission, waiting for the mission to end so it could become the primary thing again. Rick's relationship with the Smith family in the period following Rick Prime's death becomes, through the lens of the theory, the show's central question going forward. The family was always, at some level, the thing Rick was doing instead of dealing with the grief directly. He moved into the garage of a family that was not his, allowed himself to be claimed by people he had no right to claim in return, and built something that had the structure and some of the emotional reality of the domestic life that had been destroyed in Dimension C-137. With the hunt concluded and the parallel grief of Diane's multiversal erasure fresh, the Smith family is what remains. They are the replacement that was always there, that Rick invested in more genuinely and more deeply than he ever fully acknowledged. And they are now potentially the thing that the empty space left by the completed mission has to be filled with. Not as strategy, not as cover, but as the actual answer to the question of what Rick Sanchez is for now that Rick Prime is dead. The show's 8th season, running as of the current period, has been developing this territory in ways that extend the theory into the present tense. Memory Rick, the version of Rick's consciousness that has been trapped inside Jerry's mind since the events of the Jarek trap, represents one form of the fragmentation that the empty purpose theory predicts. A consciousness without a clear organizing mission, running inside an inappropriate substrate, sustained without the forward momentum that the hunt used to provide, is the theory made literal and comedic. Memory Rick inside Jerry's brain is Rick's interior life, stripped of its usual context and its usual purposes, trying to survive in conditions completely unsuited to what it is. The question of what Memory Rick has become after 2 years in Jerry's cognitive environment is the question of what Rick's interior life becomes when the structures that used to organize it are removed. Harmon's description of where Rick goes after the revenge, the conclusion that destroying yourself does not solve a problem, functions as both a character note and a structural prediction. A narcissist who has organized his self-destruction around a specific external target finds, when the target is gone, that the self-destruction was always the point, rather than the target. Rick's nihilism was never going to be resolved by killing Rick Prime because the nihilism was not caused by Rick Prime. Rick Prime caused the grief. The nihilism was what happened to the grief after decades of refusing to process it. After the armor was constructed, and the mission was launched, and the drinking became the floor, and the portal gun became the instrument of a purpose that was always, underneath its stated objective, a way of not having to stop and feel what the garage had left behind. The theory's most honest endpoint is not a prediction about what happens next in the show, because the show is still running and the answer is still forming. The most honest endpoint is a description of what the confirmed events have revealed about the structure of Rick's life across its full span. A man who had everything he wanted taken from him before he understood how much he wanted it, built a replacement structure so elaborate and so comprehensive that it could sustain him across decades and dimensions without ever requiring him to sit with the original loss. Then he completed the replacement structure and was left with the loss, unmediated, in the same condition it had always been in, waiting patiently at the bottom of everything for the day when there was nothing left to put on top of it. The revenge was always going to end this way, because the revenge was never actually about Rick Prime. Rick Prime was the instrument of the loss, and destroying the instrument could not undo what the instrument had done. Diane was gone. The Beth from Dimension C137 was gone. The life Rick had chosen over the multiverse was gone. And it had been gone since a morning in a garage, before Rick had the portal technology to do anything about it. Every year since then had been organized around the fact of that loss, while being performed as a response to it. And the performance had been convincing enough that even Rick, the smartest being in any universe he entered, had been able to sustain the confusion between the two for a very long time. The empty purpose theory is ultimately a theory about what happens when the story a person has been telling themselves about their own life reaches its conclusion before the person is ready to stop telling it. Rick killed Rick Prime. The story ended. The man who had been living inside the story was left standing in the silence after the last page, with no next chapter written and no clear understanding of who he was outside the narrative that had defined him since his 30s. What he does with that silence, and whether the Smith family and the garage and the ongoing adventures are sufficient to fill it with something that does not require another replacement structure built on top of another unexamined loss, is the question the show is currently in the process of answering. The smartest man in the universe spent decades running from the simplest problem available to a human being. He is not running anymore. The problem is still there. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.